Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, let's begin with a question you may never have considered. What did you look like before this morning? Not in photographs, not in the mirror above your bathroom sink, but truly. What did the people who lived before you, the countless generations who walked through fields and city streets and palace halls, know of their own faces? Imagine, for a moment, that you have never seen yourself. Not once, not clearly. You know the shape of your hands because you use them every day. You know your feet, your arms, the curve of your belly when you look down. But your face, the thing that everyone else sees when they speak to you, the expression you wear in joy or grief or quiet thought, that remains a mystery. You might catch a glimpse in the surface of still water, kneeling at the edge of a river on a windless morning, the trees reflected behind you, and your own features wavering with every breath of air across the surface. You might see something in the polished curve of a bronze plate, a dark and brassy shadow of yourself, the colours wrong, the details smudged. Or you might look into the eyes of someone who loves you and try to read in their gaze what it is they see. For most of human history, this was the only relationship people had with their own appearance. The face was something others possessed, something reflected back in their reactions, their recognition, the way they greeted you or turned away. The self was constructed not in private contemplation before a silvered glass, but in the web of relationships that surrounded each person from birth to death. And then, slowly, across centuries and continents, something changed. If you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, a bedroom with the lights dimmed perhaps, or a couch with a blanket pulled over your legs, take a moment to settle in. Turn down the brightness on your screen if it helps. Start a fan or a white noise machine if you like that soft hum in the background. And if you enjoy these journeys through time, if they help you drift off to sleep or simply give you a calm hour in a busy week, consider subscribing or leaving a like. But only if you genuinely want to. No pressure, no obligation. Just know that it helps these stories reach more listeners who might need them too. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey together. The oldest mirrors we've found did not come from a palace or a temple. They came from the earth itself, from the dark volcanic glass called obsidian, buried for 8,000 years beneath the soil of central Anatolia in what is now Turkey. Archaeologists working at a site called Çatalhöyük uncovered them in the remains of a Neolithic settlement, a place where people lived in mud brick houses packed so closely together that there were no streets at all. You entered your home through a hole in the roof, climbing down a ladder into the dim interior where your family slept and cooked and stored grain through the winter months. And among the things these people kept, among the bone tools and the clay figurines and the plastered skulls of ancestors, were small pieces of obsidian, rubbed and polished until the surface gleamed. Picture the work involved. Obsidian is brittle, prone to shattering if struck too hard, but when it breaks it produces edges sharper than any steel blade. To turn it into a mirror required patience beyond imagining. Someone, a craftsman perhaps, or a priest, or simply a person with time and determination, would have selected a piece of the volcanic glass, held it up to the light to check for flaws, and then begun the long process of grinding and polishing. They rubbed the surface with fine sand, then with softer materials, then with animal fat and cloth, working in small circles until the dark stone began to reflect. What emerged was not a perfect image, not the crisp reflection you see in your bathroom, but something more like a dream of yourself, a face emerging from shadow, recognizable but mysterious, the features soft and dark against the black glass. These were the first artificial mirrors. They date to around 6,000 years before the Common Era, which means that for roughly 8,000 years, human beings have been trying to see themselves more clearly. And yet even these early efforts, remarkable as they were, could only show so much. Obsidian, finely polished, could produce an image approaching the clarity of a modern mirror, but the image was always dark, always slightly distorted, always framed by the limits of the material. You could see that you had eyes, a nose, a mouth. You could perhaps check whether there was something in your teeth or a smudge on your cheek. But the full, bright, honest reflection that we take for granted, that was still thousands of years away. In Mesopotamia, around 4,000 years before the Common Era, people began to work with copper. They hammered it flat, polished it smooth, and discovered that metal too could reflect. The images were warmer than obsidian, more golden, and the surface could be shaped into curves that made the reflection larger or smaller. But copper tarnishes quickly, and the reflection it offered was never bright. Within a generation, bronze replaced it, an alloy of copper and tin that was harder, more durable, and when freshly polished, more reflective. Egyptian bronze mirrors from around 3,000 years before the common era survive in museums today, their handles carved in the shapes of lotus flowers or young women, their surfaces now dark with age but once bright enough to reflect the faces of queens and priestesses. The finest bronze mirrors, depending on their tin content, could achieve reflectivity of 60 to 70%. That sounds impressive until you consider that a modern mirror reflects more than 90% of the light that strikes it. Bronze gave you a brassy image, warm-toned and dim, serviceable but never clear. The faces people saw in these mirrors were shadows of themselves, approximations, hints. And still, for 3,000 years, bronze mirrors were the best that most of the world could do. In Han China, where craftsmen had developed their own traditions of metalworking, mirrors served purposes beyond mere vanity. They were common grave goods, placed beside the dead in their tombs, because their reflective surfaces were thought to bring life and light into the darkness of the afterlife. The Chinese, ancient scholars tell us, may have gotten the very idea of fabricating reflective surfaces from watching still water in lakes and ponds. The original mirror, the one that nature provided. A perfect sheet of water on a windless day reflects the sky and the trees, and if you lean close enough, your own face staring back at you. But water ripples at a touch, distorts with every breath of wind, and cannot be carried from place to place. Metal could go where water could not, and then there was glass. In the 1st century of the Common Era, in the workshops of Sidon, a port city on the coast of what is now Lebanon, craftsmen began experimenting with something new. They blew glass into bubbles, flattened it, backed it with metal, and discovered that glass, transparent and smooth, could carry a reflection more clearly than any bronze. The technique was imperfect, the mirrors small and cloudy, but the potential was obvious. Glass let light through, which meant that a thin layer of metal behind the glass could reflect without the tarnishing problems of an exposed bronze surface. The glass protected the reflective coating, kept it bright, made it durable. For more than 1,000 years, glassmakers across the Mediterranean and beyond tinkered with this idea. The Romans made small glass mirrors, often backed with lead. Medieval workshops produced discs of glass backed with tin or silver, but the glass itself was impure, full of bubbles and imperfections, and the images they showed were wavy and unclear. The craft was scattered, knowledge passing from master to apprentice in small workshops with no coordination, no accumulation of technique. And then, in the marshes at the northern edge of the Adriatic Sea, something extraordinary began to happen. By the mid-13th century, travellers reaching Venice would have found a city unlike any other in Europe. It rose from the water itself, built on 100 small islands, connected by bridges and canals, its foundations driven into the mud of the lagoon, on millions of wooden pilings. There was no farmland, no hinterland, no solid ground to fall back on. Venice existed because of trade, because its position at the crossroads of East and West made it the perfect middleman for the exchange of goods between the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and the kingdoms of Christian Europe. Spices from India, silk from China, gold from Africa, all of it flowed through Venetian warehouses, and the city grew rich beyond imagining. But trade goods could be stolen, copied, undercut. A city that lived by commerce needed something more secure, some source of wealth that could not be easily replicated by rivals. And so Venice became a city of secrets, a city of monopolies, a city where certain kinds of knowledge were guarded as carefully as military fortifications. The most valuable of these secrets lived on a small cluster of islands less than 2 kilometers north of the main city, a place called Murano. The glassmakers had been there for generations by the time our story truly begins. In 1291, the Venetian government had ordered all glass furnaces moved from Venice proper to Murano, officially to reduce the risk of fire. The furnaces burned day and night, and Venice's wooden buildings caught flame with terrible regularity. But there was another reason, one that the Senate understood, even if it was never quite spoken aloud. Murano was easier to control. The island could be watched, its comings and goings monitored, its workers kept under a tighter rein, than would have been possible in the crowded streets of the main city, and what workers they were. The glassmakers of Murano had inherited centuries of accumulated knowledge, Roman techniques, Byzantine innovations, secrets brought back by Venetian merchants from their travels in the East. They knew how to purify their ingredients, how to control the temperature of their furnaces, how to shape molten glass into forms of astonishing delicacy. They made goblets so thin you could see your fingers through them, chandeliers that glittered like frozen fire, beads and baubles that merchants carried to the far corners of the known world. But their greatest achievement, the thing that would eventually make Murano legendary, was still being perfected in the early 16th century. The problem with glass mirrors had always been the glass itself. Medieval glass was green or brown or full of bubbles, and even the best Venetian glassmakers of the 14th century could not produce sheets large enough and clear enough to serve as true mirrors. They called their finest product Cristallo, a glass so clear it resembled rock crystal, and the recipe was itself a closely guarded secret. A precise combination of quartz pebbles from specific riverbeds, plant ash for flux, and manganese to neutralize the green tint that iron impurities gave to ordinary glass. Cristallo was Venice's first great advantage, the foundation on which everything else would be built. But making clear glass was only half the problem. You also needed something to reflect the light, a coating that could be applied to the back of the glass without clouding or flaking or tarnishing over time. For centuries, glassmakers had experimented with various metals, lead, tin, silver, gold, but none of them adhered properly to glass. The coatings were uneven, prone to peeling, and the reflections they produced were dim and patchy. Then, in the early 16th century, a family of Murano glassmakers called the Dal Gallos discovered something remarkable. In 1507, Andrea and Domenico Dal Gallo petitioned the Council of Ten, the secretive body that oversaw Venice's security and intelligence operations, for a manufacturing privilege. They had developed a technique, they claimed, for laying a thin layer of tin over crystal plates, creating a mirror of unprecedented clarity. The council granted their request, recognizing immediately what this breakthrough might mean for Venice's position in the luxury trades of Europe. The technique itself was both simple in concept and fiendishly difficult in execution. You took a sheet of Cristallo glass, perfectly flat and polished to an extraordinary smoothness. You prepared a sheet of tin foil, thin and pure, and you laid it in a shallow tray. Then you poured mercury, quicksilver, the only metal that remains liquid at room temperature, over the tin, and the two metals combined into an amalgam, a soft and mirror-like paste. Working quickly, before the amalgam could harden, you slid the glass sheet onto the surface of the mercury-tin mixture and pressed it down, forcing out any air bubbles, ensuring perfect contact between the glass and the reflective coating. Then you waited. Over days and weeks, the mercury slowly evaporated, leaving behind a thin layer of tin bonded to the back of the glass. When you lifted the glass and turned it over, you saw yourself, not in shadow, not in bronze-coloured distortion, but clearly, brightly, as others saw you. The reflection was a revelation. For the first time in human history, ordinary people, wealthy ordinary people at least because these mirrors cost as much as a ship, could see their own faces with true fidelity. The technology rewired something fundamental about the relationship between self and appearance, between inner experience and outer presentation. A bronze mirror showed you a suggestion of yourself, a wavering and uncertain image that required imagination to complete. A Venetian glass mirror showed you the truth, or at least a truth, the face that others knew, the expression you wore without knowing you wore it. The Venetians understood immediately that they held something of immense value. Not just commercial value, though, that was considerable. The courts of Europe would pay almost anything for these perfect reflections. But strategic value, political value, the kind of advantage that could sustain a state for generations. And so, the Council of Ten, the body responsible for protecting Venice's most sensitive secrets, turned its attention to Murano. The glassmakers had always lived under certain restrictions. The concentration of furnaces on the island made it easier to enforce guild regulations, to ensure that techniques were passed from master to apprentice according to established traditions, to prevent unauthorized innovations or the theft of recipes. But the invention of the mercury tin mirror raised the stakes dramatically. This was no longer just about protecting a craft. It was about protecting an industry worth more than any gold mine, a source of wealth that could flow to Venice alone as long as the secret remained secure. The penalties for betrayal were spelled out with chilling clarity. If a glassworker left the island without permission, he would be ordered to return. This was not a polite request. It was a command from the most powerful intelligence agency in Europe, delivered by messengers who understood that their employers had reached far beyond Venice's borders. If the glassworker failed to return, his family would be imprisoned. His wife, his children, his parents, anyone who might serve as leverage, would be taken into custody and held until he complied, or until the council decided on a different course of action. And if he still did not return, if he defied the Republic's orders and continued to practice his craft in some foreign land, an assassin would be sent to kill him. This was not an empty threat. The Council of Ten maintained a network of agents across Europe, men who could track down fugitives, deliver messages, and, when necessary, administer justice on behalf of the Republic. Glassworkers who fled knew that they were not simply starting a new life, they were gambling their lives and the lives of everyone they loved against the reach of Venetian power. And yet the cage was gilded. The glassmakers of Murano were not treated as mere workers, not in the way that labourers in mines or fields were treated. They were artists, masters of a craft that brought glory to the Republic, and Venice rewarded them accordingly. By the 14th century, glassmakers had been granted the right to wear swords, a privilege normally reserved for the nobility, a mark of status that set them apart from ordinary craftsmen. They enjoyed immunity from prosecution by the Venetian state for many offences, a protection that gave them a certain freedom even within their confinement. And on December 21st, 1376, the Republic announced a policy that would have seemed extraordinary in almost any other context. If a glassmaker's daughter married a nobleman, there was no forfeiture of social class. The children of such unions would be noble, full members of Venice's ruling caste, heirs to all the privileges that came with aristocratic blood. Think about what this meant. A family of craftsmen, skilled with their hands and their furnaces, could see their grandchildren sitting in the Great Council, voting on the laws of the Republic, moving through the palaces of Venice as equals to the oldest and proudest families. The glassmakers were not prisoners in the usual sense. They were honoured captives, recognised as essential to the Republic's wealth and prestige, rewarded with status and opportunity even as they were forbidden to leave. The rhythms of their lives followed the demands of their craft. The furnaces of Murano burned constantly during the working season, consuming enormous quantities of wood and filling the island with heat and smoke and the strange, otherworldly glow of molten glass. But in the hot summers, when the heat of the furnaces became unbearable and the risk of fire reached its peak, the glassmakers rested. In the 14th century, this pause lasted 5 months, nearly half the year given over to maintenance, to repair, to the slow preparation for the next working season. By the 15th century, as techniques improved and furnaces became more efficient, the break had shortened to 3.5 months. But even then, the glassmakers enjoyed a leisure that few other workers in Europe could imagine. Murano itself was a cluster of small islands linked by short bridges, a world within a world within a world. Venice was already strange, already unlike any other city in Europe, but Murano was stranger still, a community of perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 people who all knew each other, who had intermarried for generations, who shared the secrets of their craft the way families share recipes or stories. You could not walk from one end of Murano to the other without passing someone you knew, someone whose grandfather had worked alongside your grandfather, someone whose sister had married your cousin, someone who remembered when you were a child running between the furnaces and getting underfoot. The nobles of Venice came and went as they pleased. They had business on the mainland, estates to manage, diplomatic missions that took them across Europe. But the glassmakers stayed. They watched the boats come and go from the quays, bringing raw materials and taking away finished goods, and they knew that for them, those boats travelled only in one direction. You could enter Murano as a glassmaker, but you could not leave. The same water that connected Venice to the world served as a barrier for the men who made its most valuable product. This isolation preserved the greatest economic secret of the Venetian Republic. For more than a century, no one else in Europe could make mirrors of comparable quality. There were attempts, certainly. Workshops in Germany and the Low Countries and France tried to reverse engineer the Venetian technique. But without knowing the exact composition of cristallo glass, without understanding the precise methods for preparing the mercury tin amalgam, without the generations of accumulated skill that the Murano masters passed from father to son, these attempts produced only inferior imitations. The Venetian mirrors remained unmatched, their prices remained astronomical, and the wealth continued to flow toward the lagoon. What did a mirror cost in those days? The question is difficult to answer precisely because prices varied by size and quality and by the buyer's ability to negotiate, but the accounts that survive suggest figures that would astonish a modern reader. A large Venetian mirror, the kind that might hang in a royal bedchamber or a noble reception hall, could cost as much as a merchant ship fully outfitted for a voyage. This was not jewellery, not a portable treasure that could be tucked into a pocket or hidden in a strongbox. This was a fragile sheet of glass, enormously difficult to transport without breaking, valuable precisely because of its size and its perfect clarity. Kings and queens bought Venetian mirrors not because they needed them, but because they could afford them, because the mirror itself served as proof of wealth and taste and connection to the most sophisticated craftsmen in the world. And behind each mirror, invisible but essential, was the labour of men who could not leave their island, men who had traded their freedom for status, men whose children might become nobles, but whose own feet would never touch foreign soil. The mirror was not merely a tool for seeing oneself, it was a product of secrets and imprisonment, of reward and threat, of a system designed to extract maximum value from human skill, while ensuring that the skill could never be shared. The Republic of Venice was not sentimental about these arrangements. The same Council of Ten that promised assassins for fugitive glassmakers also managed Venice's intelligence operations across Europe, intercepting diplomatic correspondence, bribing foreign officials, maintaining a network of informants that rivaled anything in the modern world. Venice had survived for centuries not by military might. Its armies were small and its territory was limited, but by information, by knowing things that others did not know, by protecting secrets that others wanted to steal. The glassmakers of Murano were simply another asset to be protected, their knowledge another secret to be guarded, their lives another calculation in the endless game of Venetian statecraft. We tend to think of mirrors as personal objects, intimate tools for grooming and self-examination. But in 16th century Europe, mirrors were political. They represented Venice's technological supremacy, its ability to produce things that no one else could produce, its position at the centre of a web of trade and knowledge that stretched from the Baltic to the Levant. To own a Venetian mirror was to announce your place in the world, your access to the finest things, your connection to the most sophisticated markets. To make a Venetian mirror was to participate in a system of control so complete that even your family could be held hostage for your loyalty. The face that looked back from the mirror saw itself clearly for the first time in human history. But the mirror itself was clouded by secrets, by threats, by the peculiar bargain that Venice had struck with its most valuable craftsmen. The reflection was true, the circumstances of its creation were anything but. As the 16th century progressed, the fame of Murano's mirrors spread across Europe. Every court wanted them, every palace needed them, and the prices only climbed higher. The glassmakers lived their contradictory lives, honoured and confined, wealthy and imprisoned, free to marry into nobility but forbidden to take a single step beyond the lagoon. The furnaces burned through the winter months, the mercury vapour rose into the air, the sheets of cristallo glass emerged smooth and clear, and the finished mirrors travelled outward in padded crates to bedeck the chambers of kings. None of this happened suddenly. The techniques had developed over generations, each master adding some small improvement to the methods he had inherited, each apprentice absorbing years of accumulated wisdom before he was trusted to work unsupervised. The guild system ensured continuity, ensured quality, ensured that the secrets remained secret. Fathers taught sons, uncles taught nephews, and the knowledge stayed within families whose ancestors had first settled on Murano centuries before. The same water surrounded them, season after season. The same lagoon stretched between their island and the towers of Venice, visible across the channel but belonging to a different world. The same boats arrived with wood for the furnaces, with soda ash and quartz pebbles and the other ingredients of glass. The same boats departed with crates of finished work, goblets and chandeliers, and increasingly the mirrors that were becoming Murano's most valuable export. The rhythm was steady, predictable. a cycle that had repeated for so long that it seemed eternal. But across the Alps and beyond the mountains, other powers were watching. They saw the wealth that flowed to Venice, the ships laden with gold and goods that entered the lagoon, the apparent ease with which the Republic converted sand and fire into treasure. They understood that whoever could make mirrors like the Venetians would capture some of that wealth for themselves, and they began to wonder whether the secrets of Murano were truly beyond discovery. The mirror looked back, clear and bright and true, but the reflection showed only what was in front of it, not the forces gathering in the world beyond, forces that would eventually bring the whole careful system crashing down. The cage was still gilded, the reward still flowed, and the glassmakers still bent over their work in the light of the furnaces, unaware that their monopoly had already begun to attract the attention of men who would stop at nothing to break it. For now, though, the water remained calm. The summers brought rest and the winters brought work, and the cycle continued as it always had. The nobles came to negotiate prices and place orders, treating the master glassmakers with the respect due to artists and essential partners in Venice's commercial enterprise. The apprentices learned their craft, the journeymen refined their skills, the masters guarded their techniques, and the Council of 10 watched over everything, ready to deploy its agents at the first sign of betrayal. This was the world that produced the mirrors, a world of extraordinary skill and extraordinary control, of privilege purchased by confinement, of beauty created under the shadow of threatened violence, the face that started everything, the face that people finally learned to see with perfect clarity, looked back from a surface born of secrets, polished by captive hands, guarded by the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in Europe. The river of history flowed on, carrying Venice toward its confrontation with the powers that envied its monopoly. But that chapter of the story, the chapter of spies and bribes and desperate gambles, still lay in the future. For now the furnaces burned, the glass cooled, the mercury vapours rose and dissipated into the salt air of the lagoon, and the mirrors of Murano continued to show the world its face. The same techniques, passed down through generations, the same families, intermarried until they were almost clans, the same island, surrounded by water that protected and imprisoned in equal measure. The same threat, never quite spoken but always understood, hovering over any craftsman who might dream of a different life in a different place, and the same reflection, clear as truth, showing faces that had never before been seen so honestly, showing kings their wrinkles and queens their grey hairs, showing the powerful that they were mortal, showing everyone who looked into a Venetian mirror exactly what the world saw when it looked at them. The face that started everything looked back, and nothing would ever be quite the same. The value of what those furnaces produced, the worth of what those captive hands created, was almost impossible for the modern mind to comprehend. We speak of expensive things today, rare paintings, precious gems, properties in fashionable quarters, but the mirrors that left Murano in the 16th and 17th centuries existed in a category of cost that seems almost fantastical. A mirror the size of a modern laptop, a surface you might prop on a desk or hang in a modest bathroom, would have cost more than a painting by Raphael. Consider that for a moment. The hand of one of the greatest artists who ever lived, the brushstrokes that captured the Madonna's gentle expression, or the philosophers of Athens in their animated debate. These commanded lower prices than a piece of silvered glass produced by anonymous craftsmen on an island in a lagoon. The Raphael would last centuries, would become more valuable with each passing generation, would hang in museums and inspire pilgrimages from around the world. The mirror would eventually tarnish, its mercury backing degrading until the reflection grew cloudy and spotted, requiring replacement. Yet the mirror cost more. This was not a quirk of the market or a temporary distortion. This was the economics of monopoly expressing itself with perfect clarity. Venice controlled something that everyone with wealth desired, and Venice alone could provide it. The laws of supply and demand operated with textbook precision. There were many painters in Italy, many workshops producing beautiful art, and while the work of the great masters commanded premium prices, a patron who could not afford Raphael could commission from a lesser brush and still acquire something lovely for his walls. But there was only one source for mirrors that showed true reflections, only one place where the techniques of crystal clear glass and mercury tin amalgam had been perfected, and if you wanted a mirror worthy of your status, you paid whatever Venice demanded. The The courts of Europe paid. They paid sums that their own ministers considered ruinous, that their treasuries struggled to accommodate, that represented not merely extravagance, but a genuine drain on national wealth. King Henry VIII of England, he of the 6 wives and the break with Rome, collected Venetian mirrors with the fervour of an obsessive. His palaces glittered with them. The reflection of that massive figure, that red-bearded king growing heavier with each passing year, looked back from surfaces that had cost his subjects dearly. Across the Channel, Francis II of France matched him purchase for purchase, the 2 monarchs competing in display as they competed in war and diplomacy, each determined to possess more and finer mirrors than the other. The rivalry between these kings expressed itself in many forms, in armies and treaties, in marriages arranged and alliances broken, but it also expressed itself in mirrors, in the accumulation of these precious objects that announced to every visitor that here was a monarch wealthy enough, powerful enough, connected enough to afford the treasures of Venice. The French nobility followed their king's example, as the nobility of every era follows the fashions of its monarch. To possess Venetian mirrors became a marker of status among the French aristocracy, a way of demonstrating that one moved in the highest circles, that one had access to the same luxuries as the crown. Money, as the chroniclers of the period noted, was considered no object in these acquisitions. A nobleman who hesitated over the cost of a mirror betrayed himself as someone of limited means, someone who did not truly belong among the great families. And so they paid, these French lords and ladies, they paid whatever the Venetian merchants demanded. They watched their fortunes flow across the Alps and down into the lagoon, and they hung their mirrors with pride. One French countess captured the spirit of this peculiar commerce in a remark that survived the centuries. She had traded an entire wheat farm, acres of productive land, the peasants who worked it, the barns and mills and all the apparatus of agricultural wealth, for a single Venetian mirror. Asked about this apparently one-sided exchange, she expressed only delight. "Did I not work wonders?" she said. "Some wheat for this beautiful mirror. The wheat would have fed her household and provided income for generations. The mirror would hang on her wall and show her face growing older year by year, until the backing degraded and a new mirror was needed." But in the calculus of aristocratic status, the mirror was worth more than the wheat. The wheat was merely useful. The mirror was magnificent. Marie de Medici, that formidable queen who would become regent of France and patron of Rubens and central figure in the religious wars that tore her adopted country apart, demonstrated the scale at which royalty engaged in this trade. A single shipment from Murano to Paris contained 119 custom mirrors, each crafted to her specifications, each wrapped and crated with extraordinary care for the journey across the Alps and down the river routes into France. 119 mirrors for one client, and this was merely a single order among many. The Venetian workshops laboured to meet the demand. The boats crossing the lagoon carried an endless stream of crates, and the gold and silver flowed back in exchange, filling the Venetian treasury, enriching the merchants who served as middlemen, rewarding the glassmaking families who held the secrets. The inequality of this trade troubled the minds of practical men who cared more about national prosperity than aristocratic display. Gold was leaving France for Venice, leaving England for Venice, leaving the German states and the Spanish territories, and everywhere else that aspired to elegance. The mirrors themselves could not be eaten or worn into battle or used to pay the soldiers who defended borders. They were beautiful, certainly. They reflected light with unprecedented clarity and showed faces with unprecedented truth. But they were also, from the perspective of a royal treasury, a kind of wound through which wealth steadily bled away. To understand why this mattered, why the mirror trade represented something more than the ordinary commerce in luxuries, you had to trace the supply chain that made these objects possible. Venice sat at a choke point where multiple streams of raw materials converged, each stream controlled in its own way, each contributing to the final product that only Venice could produce. The soda ash that formed the flux, the substance that lowered the melting point of silica and made the glass workable, came from plants that grew in Syria, along the eastern Mediterranean coast. These plants concentrated sodium compounds from the salty soil, and when burned, their ashes provided the sodium carbonate that Venetian glassmakers needed. The trade routes that brought this ash to the lagoon were ancient and well established, running through ports that Venice had dominated for centuries. passing through markets where Venetian merchants had long-standing relationships with suppliers. Other glassmakers, attempting to produce comparable work elsewhere, could not simply purchase this ash on the open market. The Venetians controlled the supply, or enough of it to maintain their advantage. The manganese that removed the green tint from glass, that transformed ordinary silica into the cristallo that was Venice's signature achievement, came from mines in Piedmont, in the mountains that separated Italy from France. The mineral called pyrolusite, a black stone containing manganese dioxide, was essential to the recipe. Without it, the glass carried a persistent greenish colour, the iron impurities in the sand expressing themselves visibly. With it, the glass became water clear, invisible, as close to pure transparency as human craft could achieve. Venice controlled the routes from these mines, the relationships with the miners, the knowledge of exactly how much manganese to add and when to add it to achieve the desired effect. The tin that formed half of the mercury tin amalgam, the backing that turned a piece of glass into a mirror came from Cornwall, from those ancient mines at the western tip of England where tin had been extracted since the Bronze Age. The trade in Cornish tin was older than Venice itself, stretching back to the Phoenicians who sailed from the eastern Mediterranean in search of this essential metal. By the early modern period, Venice had established its position in this trade as well, purchasing tin through established channels and bringing it across Europe to the lagoon. And the mercury, that liquid silver that flowed like water and bonded with tin to create the reflective surface, this too flowed through Venice. The cinnabar mines of Almaden in Spain, the oldest mercury mines in the world, had produced the raw ore for centuries. Other sources existed in the mountains of Central Europe, in territories controlled by the Habsburgs. Venice, positioned at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade, drew mercury from these sources and others, accumulating the reserves needed to back an endless stream of mirrors. What this meant in practical terms was that Venice had constructed a system that was not merely about technique, but about control of the physical substances that made the technique possible. A rival power wishing to produce comparable mirrors would need to master the craft, difficult enough given the secrecy surrounding it, but would also need to establish alternative supply chains for half a dozen specialised materials, each currently flowing through channels that Venice dominated. The secret was not merely how to make a mirror. The secret was how to assemble the entire apparatus of production, from Syrian ash to Cornish tin, from Piedmontese manganese to Spanish mercury, and to do so in a way that could compete with workshops that had been perfecting their processes for generations. The powers of Europe looked at this situation and found it intolerable. The gold that flowed to Venice might as well have been blood draining from their economies. Every mirror that hung on a French wall represented wealth that had left France forever, that would never return, that enriched a foreign power whose interest often conflicted with French interests. The same calculation applied to England, to the German principalities, to everyone who participated in this one-sided trade. The desire for mirrors was not going to diminish. If anything, it was growing as more and more wealthy people saw what mirrors could do, how they could transform a room with light and space, how they could reveal the face that had always been hidden. The only solution was to break the monopoly, to find some way to acquire the secrets of Murano and reproduce them elsewhere. This brings us to France, and to a king whose appetite for magnificence exceeded even that of his predecessors, and to a minister who understood that magnificence required economic foundations, that glory was expensive, that a nation dependent on foreign luxuries could never truly be great. Louis XIV ascended to the throne of France in 1643 when he was 4 years old. His early years were marked by regency, by civil war, by the humiliations of the Fronde, when Parisian mobs threatened the royal family and the young king was forced to flee his own capital. These experiences left their mark. When Louis came into his full power as an adult, he was determined to never again be vulnerable, never again be humiliated, never again allow any force in France to challenge the absolute authority of the crown. He would be the Sun King, the centre around which everything revolved, the source of all light and all power in his realm, and he would build, as no French king had built before, palaces and gardens and monuments that announced his glory to the world. The palace at Versailles began as a hunting lodge, a modest retreat from Paris where Louis's father had enjoyed country pursuits. Under Louis XIV, it became something else entirely. Year by year, decade by decade, the structure expanded. consuming surrounding villages, transforming the landscape, growing into one of the largest and most elaborate palaces ever constructed. Thousands of workers laboured on the site. The greatest architects and artists of the age contributed their talents. The gardens stretched to the horizon, nature itself bent to the king's will, water pumped uphill to feed fountains that defied the laws of physics through sheer expenditure of resources. And in the heart of this palace, connecting the king's apartments to the queen's apartments, there was originally an open terrace. Windows on one side looked out over the gardens and the setting sun. The terrace itself was pleasant enough, a covered walkway suited to the mild seasons, but it was not remarkable. It did not announce anything. It did not proclaim the glory of the king who walked through it. Louis and his architects conceived of something different. They would enclose this terrace, creating an interior gallery stretching 73 metres from one end to the other. On one side, 17 great arched windows would admit the light of the western sky. And on the opposite side, 17 matching arches would be filled not with windows but with mirrors. 357 individual mirror panels arranged to face the windows, catching every ray of sunlight and bouncing it back into the gallery, multiplying the illumination, creating an effect that visitors would describe as overwhelming, as almost supernatural, as being inside light itself. The Hall of Mirrors was completed in 1684 to designs by Jules Ardouin Mansart, the architect who did more than anyone else to give Versailles its final form. Above the mirrors and the windows on the vaulted ceiling, the painter Charles Lebrun covered the surface with 30 painted compositions depicting the glorious history of Louis XIV during the first 18 years of his personal rule, from 1661 to the peace treaties of Nijmegen in 1678 and 1679. The king's victories in war and diplomacy played out overhead in allegorical form, gods and goddesses attending to the affairs of France. Louis himself rendered in the conventions of classical heroism, larger than life, more than mortal. But it was the mirrors, not the paintings, that made the gallery what it was. 357 panels of reflective glass, each one showing the visitors their own images along with the images of everyone else in that vast space. The light from the windows bouncing and rebouncing until the whole gallery seemed to dissolve into pure luminosity. At night, when candles were lit in the chandeliers, the effect intensified, flames multiplying endlessly in the facing mirrors, a single candle becoming 100 candles, 100 candles becoming 1,000, the gallery transformed into a space that seemed infinite, that seemed to extend forever in every direction. And always, wherever you stood in that gallery, the figure of the king dominated, his image reflected and re-reflected, his presence multiplied across every surface, the Sun King radiating outward as his celestial namesake radiated light. This was political theatre of the most sophisticated kind. Every ambassador who walked through the Hall of Mirrors, every foreign prince who visited Versailles to treat with France, every nobleman who came to pay respects to his king, all of them experienced the same overwhelming display of wealth and power and taste. The message was unmistakable. France was the greatest power in Europe, Louis was the greatest monarch of his age, and resistance to French dominance was futile. You could not negotiate as an equal with someone who possessed such resources, who could build such wonders, who could fill a 73-metre gallery with mirrors when a single mirror still cost more than a painting by Raphael. The political function of the Hall of Mirrors was explicit and intentional. Louis used it for the most important ceremonies of state. Treaties were signed there, including eventually the treaty that would end the First World War more than 2 centuries later. The German delegation forced to accept terms in the very hall where Prussian kings had once been humiliated by French grandeur. Audiences with ambassadors took place there, the foreign envoys walking the full length of that dazzling gallery, surrounded by French nobles, approaching the throne where Louis sat in majesty. Even daily life was conducted there, the king processing through on his way from his chambers to the chapel, courtiers lining the route, everyone performing the rituals of power and submission that the architecture demanded. But there was something else about the Hall of Mirrors, something that made it not merely an expression of French power, but a declaration of independence, a monument to a battle won. Those 357 mirror panels were not Venetian. They had not been shipped across the Alps from Murano. They had not enriched the merchants of the lagoon or contributed to the treasury of the Serene Republic. They were French mirrors, produced by French workers using techniques that the French had acquired through means that Venice considered criminal. The Hall of Mirrors was, among other things, a trophy. It announced to the world that France had broken the Venetian monopoly, that the secrets of Murano were secrets no longer, that the gold which had once flowed to Venice would henceforth remain in France. Every panel in that vast gallery was evidence of a successful act of industrial espionage, a covert operation planned and executed by the French state, a theft of knowledge that Venice had guarded for over a century and had been willing to kill to protect. The man who conceived and directed this operation was Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the most capable minister Louis XIV ever employed. Colbert had risen from humble origins. His father was a merchant, his grandfather a farmer, to become the Controller General of Finances, the most powerful administrative position in France. He was not a soldier or a nobleman or a diplomat of the traditional kind. He was a bureaucrat in the most capable sense of the word, a man who understood ledgers and supply chains and the flow of money through an economy. He understood that power rested ultimately on wealth, that armies required funding, that magnificence required revenue, and that a nation which sent its gold abroad for luxuries it could not produce at home was a nation slowly impoverishing itself. Colbert looked at the mirror trade and saw a problem that demanded solution. France desired mirrors. France would continue to desire mirrors, and as long as Venice held the monopoly, every mirror that entered France represented gold that left France. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The solution, however, was not simple at all. The Venetians had spent centuries perfecting their techniques, had developed supply chains that competitors could not easily replicate, had implemented security measures that made direct observation of their methods impossible. The punishment for revealing the secrets of Murano was death. The punishment for attempting to leave the island without permission was death, or worse, depending on how the Council of Ten chose to express its displeasure. The families of any craftsman who fled would face consequences as well, held as hostages against the defector's silence. Colbert did not let any of this deter him. In 1665, he dispatched agents to Venice with instructions to achieve the impossible. They were to find glassworkers from Murano willing to flee to France. They were to offer whatever inducements were necessary, as gold, titles, protection, whatever it took. They were to evade the surveillance of the Council of Ten, smuggle the defectors out of Venice, and transport them safely to Paris, where they would establish a French mirror manufactory. The mission was espionage of the most direct and dangerous kind, conducted against a state famous for its intelligence capabilities, with consequences for failure that included imprisonment, torture, and execution. The agents Colbert sent were not amateurs. They understood the risks and they understood the techniques of covert operation. They moved carefully through Venice, making contacts, sounding out potential recruits, building trust over time. The Murano glassworkers they approached faced an agonizing choice. On one side lay everything they knew, their families, their homes, their island, the only community that understood and valued their skills. On the other side lay the promise of wealth and freedom in France, the chance to practice their craft without the constant surveillance, the opportunity to be something other than gilded prisoners. And in between lay the very real possibility of death, of being caught before they could escape, of being tracked down even after they reached France. Some agreed. A glassworker known in the records as Lamotta, along with 2 or 3 others whose names have been partially preserved, made the fateful decision. They would flee Murano, they would go to France, they would share what they knew with Louis XIV's minister and help establish a French mirror industry. Whether they fully understood what they were agreeing to, whether they appreciated the forces that would pursue them, whether they realized that they were betraying not just their guild and their government, but their own families who would suffer for their absence. These questions the records do not answer. They agreed, and Colbert's agents began planning the escape. The details of how they got out, the routes they took, the disguises they wore, the bribes they paid, these specifics have been lost to time. What we know is that they succeeded. Lamotta and his companions reached Paris, where they were received with the honours due to men who carried secrets worth more than gold. Colbert established them in comfortable circumstances and set them to work. The Royal Manufacture of Mirrors was founded in 1665, a state-sponsored enterprise designed to do what the Venetians had done, to produce mirrors of the highest quality and to do so without sending another ducat to the lagoon. The reaction from Venice was immediate and furious. When the Council of Ten learned that skilled glassworkers had defected to France, they deployed the full apparatus of state security. The families of the defectors were seized as hostages, held against the possibility that threats to their loved ones might convince the fugitives to return. Agents were dispatched to Paris itself, not disguised or subtle, but official representatives making explicit demands. France must return these men, these thieves of Venetian property, these criminals who had violated the laws of the Republic. The French refused. The defectors were under royal protection now, servants of Louis XIV, beyond the reach of Venetian justice. The Council of Ten had expected this. They had other means at their disposal. The word that came from Venice was poison. The defectors were warned, return immediately or face consequences more permanent than any threat. Those who remained in France would die. The method was specified. Agents of the Republic would ensure that they never enjoyed the fruits of their betrayal. The letters made clear that this was not an idle threat. Venice had a long history of dealing with those who threatened its interests, and death came to enemies of the state even in foreign lands where Venetian law did not apply. Whether actual poisoning attempts occurred, the historical evidence suggests that they did. Records survive indicating that when some of the glassworkers refused to return despite the threats, mysterious illnesses followed. The connection between these illnesses and Venetian agents was suspected at the time and has been generally accepted by historians since. Some of the defectors died. Others, frightened by the deaths of their companions, abandoned the French enterprise and fled back to Venice, hoping to throw themselves on the mercy of the Council of Ten, hoping that their return might spare them and their families further punishment. But enough remained, and enough had already been shared, that Colbert had what he needed. The techniques of making cristallo glass, the methods of applying the mercury tin amalgam, the proportions and procedures that produced the famous clarity of Venetian mirrors, these were no longer secrets. French craftsmen had learned them from the defectors, and French craftsmen would continue the work even after the Venetians themselves were gone. Moreover, the French would add an innovation of their own. The traditional method of making large mirror panels involved blowing the glass into a bubble, then cutting and flattening it, a technique that imposed natural limits on how large a mirror could be. French technicians developed a different approach. Instead of blowing the glass, they poured molten glass onto flat iron tables and rolled it smooth while still hot. This technique of plate casting could produce larger and more uniform panels than the Venetian method allowed. It was a genuinely original contribution, a case of students surpassing their teachers. By the time the Hall of Mirrors was completed in 1684, the royal manufacture had mastered both the Venetian techniques and the French innovations. The 357 panels that faced those 17 windows were produced entirely in France, by French workers, using French materials and French methods. The 73-metre gallery announced not only the glory of the Sun King, but the end of Venetian supremacy in the mirror trade. What had been a monopoly was now a competition, and in competition, other advantages would come into play. Advantages of scale, of access to local markets, of proximity to other centres of industry. Venice would continue to produce mirrors, would continue to be known for quality and craftsmanship, but the days when Venice alone could supply Europe's appetite for reflection were over. The light that filled the Hall of Mirrors, the light that bounced from window to mirror and back again, that multiplied candles into apparent infinity, that surrounded Louis XIV with his own reflected image wherever he stood. This light carried a message to every visitor, and especially to every Venetian who might hear of it. The secrets had been stolen. The monopoly had been broken. The cage that held the glassmakers of Murano had proven insufficient to contain what they knew. And a king who had once depended on foreign craftsmen for the instruments of his magnificence now stood surrounded by French glass, French workmanship, French ingenuity that had taken what Venice possessed and made it France's own. The water of the lagoon still surrounded Murano. The furnaces still burned there, the glass still cooled and hardened, the masters still trained their apprentices in techniques refined over generations. But something had changed, and everyone knew it. The reflection in the mirror showed a world that was different now, a world where Venice was no longer the sole possessor of its most valuable secret. The face that started everything, the face that people had learned to see with unprecedented clarity, could now look back from surfaces produced in Paris as well as Venice, and once the secret was out, there would be no calling it back. The question that remained in the years that followed was how it had all been accomplished. The completed Hall of Mirrors stood as evidence that France had succeeded, but the story of that success, the actual mechanics of how Kolber's agents had pried the secrets from Murano's grasp, was a tale of shadows and whispers, of gold changing hands in candlelit rooms, of men slipping away from their homes in the dark of night, and of a republic that would stop at nothing to punish those who betrayed it. Kolber had begun his campaign in 1664, a full year before the royal manufacture would officially receive its letters patent. He understood that establishing a mirror industry was not merely a matter of building furnaces and hiring workers. The knowledge itself had to be obtained, and that knowledge resided in the minds of perhaps a few hundred men in the world, nearly all of them confined to a single small island in the Venetian lagoon. To build a French mirror industry, he would first need to steal the souls of Murano. His agents fanned out across Europe with bags of gold and promises that glittered as brightly as any mirror. French citizenship awaited those who would come, comfortable positions in a royal manufactory protected by the crown itself, freedom from the suffocating control of the Council of Ten, freedom from the island that was both home and prison. For men who had spent their lives forbidden to travel, forbidden to share their skills, forbidden even to speak too freely about their work, these offers must have seemed like a glimpse of another world entirely. The recruitment was handled with care. Colbert's ambassador in Venice, Piero Bonsi, received detailed instructions on how to proceed. The approach had to be subtle. Direct contact with the glassworkers was risky. They were watched constantly, their movements noted, their conversations potentially reported to the inquisitors of state. Instead, intermediaries were employed, men who could move between worlds without attracting undue attention. Merchants with business connections to the glass trade, servants who worked in the households of master glassmakers, anyone who might carry a whispered offer to the right ears. The first to accept were a maestro known as La Motta and his 2 apprentices. Their decision to flee was not made lightly. They knew what they risked. They had seen what happened to those who attempted to carry the secrets beyond Venice's reach. But the French offers were substantial. Not merely wages, but dowries, estates, the prospect of advancement in a country where they would not be marked forever as glassworkers, confined to a single profession and a single island for all their days. One unmarried worker was promised a dowry of 75,000 livres if he would marry a Parisian woman, a sum that represented more wealth than most Murano craftsmen would see in a lifetime. The escape route had been planned in advance. The workers could not simply book passage on a ship departing Venice. Every vessel leaving the lagoon was watched, every passenger noted. Instead, they travelled overland, making their way to Ferrara, far enough from Venetian territory that they might breathe a little easier, though not so far that the Republic's reach could not still find them. From Ferrara, they continued by coach, the long journey northward through the Italian peninsula, over the Alps, and finally into France. How many days that journey took, how many anxious nights they spent in unfamiliar inns, starting at every sound, we can only imagine. But they arrived, eventually, in Paris, where they found that Colbert had prepared a workshop for them and was eager to put their knowledge to use. For a brief moment, it must have seemed that the hardest part was over. They had escaped the island. They had crossed the mountains. They were under the protection of the most powerful monarch in Europe. What could Venice do to them now? The answer came swiftly, and it was exactly what they should have expected. When the Council of Ten learned that glassworkers had gone missing, and they learned quickly, for Murano was a small place where absences were noticed, the machinery of state vengeance began to turn. The families of the defectors were the first to feel it. These were not merely distant relatives, but wives, children, parents, siblings, people who had been left behind, perhaps with promises that they would be sent for once the defectors were safely established in France. Instead, they found themselves treated as hostages. The council made clear that the fate of these families depended entirely on the behaviour of the men who had fled. Letters were dispatched to the defectors. We do not have the exact text of these communications, but their nature is well documented. They began with appeals to loyalty, to family feeling, to the honour that a Muranese glass master owed to the Republic that had nurtured his craft for generations. They reminded the defectors of all that Venice had given them, the privileges, the status, the security of belonging to an ancient and honoured trade. They suggested that return was still possible, that forgiveness might be extended if the wayward workers came home before too much damage was done. When appeals failed, the letters grew more pointed. The health of elderly parents was mentioned. The situation of wives and children, now under close observation by authorities, was described in terms that left little to the imagination. The Council of Ten had centuries of experience in persuasion of this kind. They knew how to apply pressure without making explicit threats that might be quoted against them. The message was clear nonetheless. Your families will suffer for your betrayal. But the defectors did not return. Whether from fear of what awaited them in Venice, or from genuine commitment to their new lives in France, or simply from the calculation that they had already burned their bridges beyond repair, they stayed in Paris and continued their work. And so, the Council of Ten escalated its response. The Venetian ambassador in Paris, Alvisi Sagredo, was tasked with locating the missing workers. This was not difficult. The French were not particularly trying to hide them. Indeed, the entire point of recruiting them was to put their skills to use in a royal manufactory, not to keep them hidden away. Sagredo found where they had established their workshop and reported back to Venice. Now the council knew exactly where its prey could be found. What followed was, in the language of a later era, an intelligence operation. Emissaries were sent to Paris, not merely diplomats making formal representations to the French court, but agents with more specific instructions. They were to make contact with the defectors directly. They were to offer clemency if the workers would return. They were to explain, in person, exactly what would happen to their families if they did not. And if persuasion failed, other methods might be employed. The historical record becomes murky here, as it tends to do when states engage in their darker arts. But the circumstantial evidence is compelling. Among the glassworkers in Paris, mysterious illnesses began to appear. Men who had been healthy enough to make the long journey from Venice to France, healthy enough to establish a workshop and begin producing glass, suddenly fell sick. The symptoms were consistent with poisoning: stomach pains that grew progressively worse, weakness, the gradual failure of bodily systems. In 1667, a mirror polisher died in agony from stomach pains. Whether he was one of the original defectors or a French worker who had learned from them, whether his death was the result of poison or some other cause, we cannot say with certainty. But the other workers drew their own conclusions. They had heard the threats, they had received the letters, they knew what Venice was capable of, and now one of their number was dead, and the manner of his death suggested that the Council of Ten's reach extended even to Paris. The atmosphere in the workshop became one of fear and paranoia. Men who had dreamed of freedom now found themselves looking over their shoulders constantly, wondering if the next meal might be their last, wondering if the friendly stranger who struck up a conversation might be carrying more than words. Some of them could take it no longer, despite everything they had risked, despite the journey they had made and the bridges they had burned. They abandoned the French enterprise and fled back toward Venice, hoping that their voluntary return might buy some measure of mercy for themselves and their families. We do not know what happened to these returning workers. The Council of Ten's deliberations were secret, their sentences often carried out without public announcement. Perhaps some were forgiven, their skills too valuable to waste on punishment. Perhaps others served as examples, their fates a warning to anyone else who might consider betraying the Republic's secrets. The records are silent, and silence in Venice often meant the worst. But the French operation continued despite these losses. La Motta himself survived, bearing the wound of a gunfight that had erupted at some point during the troubled period, a bullet to the shoulder that he would carry for the rest of his days as a souvenir of his decision to share Venice's secrets with France. The circumstances of this gunfight remain obscure. Who was shooting at whom? Were Venetian agents involved, or was it some other kind of dispute? The sources mention broken mirrors everywhere, as if the violence had taken place in the workshop itself, surrounded by the very products that had made these men valuable enough to kill over. The chief glassworker Rivetta was also involved in this incident, according to the records. Here we must be careful about what we claim to know. A man named Rivetta appears in documented accounts of these events, but whether he was one of a set of brothers, whether he led a family group of defectors, these details cannot be verified from the sources that have survived. What we can say is that among the Venetian workers who made their way to France, who endured the threats and the poisoning attempts and the violence, there were men named Rivetta, and that they played some role in the desperate drama that unfolded in those workshops on the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. What made all of this worthwhile, from Colbert's perspective, was not merely the labour these men could provide, but the knowledge they carried in their heads. The techniques that had been developed over centuries on Murano, the proportions and procedures and subtle adjustments that made the difference between ordinary glass and cristallo, between a cloudy reflection and perfect clarity, these could not be learned from books, because no books described them. They could not be reverse engineered by examining finished mirrors, because the finished product gave no clue to the 1,000 small decisions that went into making it. They could only be transmitted from master to apprentice, from hands that knew the work to hands that were learning it, and now, despite everything Venice had done to prevent it, that transmission was happening in Paris. The Manufacture Royale de Glace de Miroir had been established by letters patent in October of 1665, with a financier named Nicolas Dunoyer as its first director. The workshop occupied premises in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the eastern edge of Paris, where industries that produced smoke and noise and fire were traditionally located, away from the more genteel neighbourhoods closer to the centre. Here the Venetian workers laboured under French supervision, teaching French apprentices what they knew, demonstrating techniques that had never before been seen outside of Murano. The first unblemished mirrors were produced in 1666. This was the crucial threshold. For all the expense and danger and diplomatic complications of recruiting the Venetian workers, for all the lives lost and families destroyed, the entire enterprise would have been worthless if the French could not actually produce mirrors of acceptable quality. But they did. The cristallo glass emerged from the furnaces clear and bright. The mercury tin amalgam adhered smoothly to its surface. The reflections that looked back from these mirrors were sharp and true, indistinguishable from what Venice produced. Colbert had what he wanted. The knowledge had been transferred. French craftsmen now possessed skills that had taken Venice centuries to develop. And once the knowledge was in French hands, the Venetian workers themselves became in a sense expendable. Valuable still, certainly, but no longer irreplaceable. The grim calculation behind the entire operation was now laid bare. Venice had threatened and poisoned and killed to protect its secrets, but the secrets had been extracted before the last effector died or fled. In March of 1667, the remaining Venetian workers were sent back. The circumstances of this return are not entirely clear. Were they expelled by the French, no longer needed now that their knowledge had been transmitted? Did they choose to return, hoping that voluntary departure might bring better treatment than forced extraction? Had some arrangement been made through diplomatic channels, some face-saving compromise that allowed both France and Venice to claim partial victory? The records do not say. What we know is that the Venetians left, and the French continued without them. Their replacement was a man named Richard Lucas de Nehu, a gentleman glassmaker who brought with him his glassworks at Tour-la-Ville in Normandy. De Nehu was not a Venetian. He had never set foot on Murano, but he had mastered the white glass-blowing technique necessary to produce mirror glass in what the French called the Venetian manner, evidence that the knowledge was already spreading, already being learned and replicated by craftsmen who had never been part of the original conspiracy. The monopoly was not merely broken, but dissolving, the precious secrets dispersing like smoke across Europe. Under de Nehu's direction, the French mirror industry took on a new shape. The glass would now be blown in Normandy, at Tour-la-Ville, taking advantage of the abundant fuel supplies and skilled workers available there. The raw panels would then be transported to Paris, where they would be ground, polished and backed with the mercury tin amalgam before being sold to eager customers. This division of labour made the enterprise more efficient and less dependent on any single location or group of workers. It was becoming an industry rather than a craft, a system rather than an art. The transition was not without difficulties. Despite having the knowledge of how to make Venetian quality mirrors, the French manufactory sometimes found itself unable to keep up with demand or to maintain consistent quality. At times, the Compagnie du Noyer was reduced to importing Venetian glass and finishing it in France, a humiliating admission that the students had not yet fully surpassed their teachers. But the trend was clear. Month by month, year by year, French production improved, French quality rose, French capacity expanded. By September of 1672, The royal French manufacturer was sufficiently established that Louis XIV could take a decisive step. The importation of glass was forbidden to any of his subjects. Venice's remaining access to the French market, the ability to sell raw or finished glass to French merchants who would then resell it domestically, was now cut off entirely. France would make its own mirrors, buy its own mirrors, and sell its own mirrors. The umbilical cord that had connected French vanity to Venetian craftsmanship was severed at last. The proof of French success would come 6 years later, in 1678, when the manufactory received the commission that would make its reputation the glass for the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. This was not merely a large order, but a test of French capabilities at the highest level. The panels would need to be larger, more uniform, and more perfect than anything the industry had yet produced. They would be installed in the most important room of the most important palace in Europe, where every floor would be visible to the most discerning eyes in the world. If the French could produce this glass, they could produce anything. They could, and they did. The techniques that the Venetian defectors had brought with them, combined with the innovations that French craftsmen had developed, particularly the plate casting method that allowed for larger panels than blowing could achieve, proved equal to the challenge. The 357 mirrors that filled the gallery were French in every sense, made by French workers, in French workshops, using methods that France now owned as thoroughly as Venice ever had. The financial transformation was equally dramatic. By the end of Louis XIV's reign, the French mirror industry was exporting mirrors throughout Europe worth between 300,000 and 400,000 livres in gold per year. The flow of wealth had reversed. Where France had once sent gold to Venice in exchange for mirrors, now mirrors flowed out of France and gold flowed in. The French monopoly had replaced the Venetian monopoly, and the student had become the master. For Venice, the loss was more than economic. The mirror trade had been a source of pride as well as profit, a demonstration of Venetian superiority in the arts of civilization. To lose that trade to France, which Venice had long regarded as culturally inferior, a nation of soldiers and farmers rather than artists and craftsmen, was a humiliation that stung beyond any calculation of a lost revenue. The Council of Ten had deployed all the weapons at its disposal: surveillance and threats, hostage-taking and assassination, the full apparatus of state terror that had kept so many other secrets safe for so long. And it had not been enough. The glass workers of Murano still practiced their craft. The furnaces still burned. The masters still trained their apprentices. The ancient traditions continued from generation to generation. But something essential had changed. The knowledge was no longer theirs alone. The techniques that had made Venice the mirror of the world could now be found in workshops scattered across Europe, taught by men who had learned them in Paris, who had learned them from men who had fled Murano with French gold in their pockets and French promises in their ears. The cage had been breached, and what had escaped could never be recaptured. The river of history flowed on, as rivers do, carrying Venice toward a future in which it would be one mirror maker among many, rather than the sole source of reflection for an entire continent. The Republic would endure for another century and more, its decline gradual and dignified, its traditions maintained even as its power waned. The masters of Murano would continue to produce glass of exceptional quality, their skills handed down through families that had practiced the craft for 20 generations and more. But the world had changed around them, and the change could not be undone. And in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the light still played across those 357 panels, still multiplied the candles into apparent infinity, still surrounded anyone who walked that 73-metre gallery with their own reflected image, repeated endlessly in every direction. The hall stood as a monument to many things, to the glory of the Sun King, to the ambitions of absolute monarchy, to the artistic achievements of Ardouin Mansart and Lebrun. But it was also a monument to something darker, to stolen secrets and broken families, to men who died far from home with poison in their bellies, to the ruthless calculus that weighed human lives against industrial advantage and found the exchange acceptable. The face that looked back from those mirrors, whether the face of a king or a courtier or a servant passing through on some errand, was seeing itself by means of knowledge that had been bought with blood, the clarity of the reflection, the perfection of the glass, the brightness that filled that magnificent space. All of it rested on a foundation of espionage and betrayal, of threats and counter-threats, of a secret war waged in the shadows while diplomats exchanged pleasantries in the light. This was the true cost of a mirror, in the age when mirrors were still rare enough to kill for. Not merely the materials and labour that went into its making, not merely the gold that changed hands when it was sold, but the human toll exacted by the systems that produced it and protected it, and ultimately stole it. The glassworkers of Murano had lived in a gilded cage, pampered and imprisoned, their skills too valuable to be allowed to escape. The defectors who fled to France had been pawns in a game played by ministers and councils, their lives risked and sometimes lost in the service of national ambitions they barely understood. And the families left behind, the wives and children and elderly parents held hostage against the defectors' cooperation, had suffered most of all, caught between powers that cared nothing for their well-being and everything for the secrets their relatives carried. The mirror, that simple object, that sheet of glass backed with metal that returns our image to our eyes. By the late 17th century it had become entangled with some of the darkest aspects of state power, espionage and assassination, monopoly and punishment, the willingness of governments to threaten and kill in the service of economic advantage. These were not aberrations but logical consequences of a system that made certain knowledge too valuable to be shared. When a craft becomes a state secret, the state will use all its tools to protect it. And states, as Venice and France both demonstrated, have tools that ordinary craftsmen cannot hope to resist. The light still falls through those 17 windows at Versailles. The mirrors still hang in their gilded frames, a little dimmer now perhaps than they were in Louis XIV's day, but still functional, still reflecting, still doing what mirrors have always done. Visitors still walk the length of that gallery, still see themselves multiplied in every direction, still feel the strange disorientation of being surrounded by their own image. Few of them, probably, think about the Venetian glassworkers who died in Paris, or the families imprisoned in Venice, or the ministers who calculated that these costs were acceptable in the service of greater goals. But the history is there, embedded in the glass itself, invisible but indelible. Every reflection carries within it the memory of how reflection became possible, the long chain of discovery and refinement and theft that brought the mirror from the obsidian pools of prehistoric Anatolia to the grandest palace in Europe. The face that looks back at us from the mirror is our own, but the means by which we see it was shaped by forces far beyond any individual life, by the rise and fall of empires, by the greed of kings and the cunning of ministers, by the desperation of craftsmen trapped between powers that used them without regard for their humanity. And the story was not over. The French had broken Venice's monopoly, but the mirror itself would continue to evolve, would continue to transform both the technology by which it was made and the societies into which it was introduced. The mercury that gave mirrors their reflective backing would exact its own toll on the workers who handled it. The spread of affordable mirrors to the middle classes would reshape how ordinary people understood themselves and their place in the world. The religious and philosophical implications of widespread self-reflection would trouble theologians and thinkers for generations to come. And still the river of time flowed onward, carrying the mirror trade into new channels that would have astonished even the most far-sighted of the Venetian masters. For while France had succeeded in stealing Venice's secrets, the deeper transformation that followed had nothing to do with espionage at all. The most consequential development in mirror-making history did not emerge from smuggled recipes or bribed craftsmen, but from a question that no one in Murano had ever thought to ask. What if we stopped blowing glass altogether? The Venetian method, for all its refinement, for all the generations of accumulated skill that had gone into perfecting it, remained fundamentally constrained by the limits of human breath. A glass blower could inflate only so large a bubble before the laws of physics intervened. The cylinder that resulted, once split and flattened, could produce a mirror of perhaps 40 inches in length, perhaps a little more in the hands of the most skilled practitioners, but no larger. This was an absolute boundary, as fixed as the size of a man's lungs or the strength of a man's arms, and for centuries no one had seen any reason to question it. The blown cylinder was simply how glass was made. It was the method that had come down from antiquity, the method that Venice had refined to its highest possible form, and the method that France had gone to such lengths to acquire. But in the workshops of Orleans, in the decades following the Great Theft, a different kind of mind was at work. Bernard Perrault had been born in Altair in 1619, in that same northern Italian tradition of glassmaking that had supplied so many of Venice's techniques and so many of its secrets. He had established his own glass house on the 13th of July 1662 in the French city of Orléans, far from the watchful eyes of the Council of Ten and free to experiment as no Milanese craftsman could ever have done. And the question that consumed him was this: why blow glass at all when you might simply pour it? The idea seems obvious in retrospect, as all great innovations do once they have been achieved. Molten glass is a liquid, after all, however viscous and peculiar a liquid it might be. It flows, it spreads, it seeks its own level like any other fluid. What if, instead of capturing that liquid within a fragile bubble and coaxing it into shape through breath and skill, you simply poured it out onto a flat surface and let gravity do the work? The resulting sheet would be limited not by the capacity of human lungs, but by the size of the table onto which it was poured, and tables could be made as large as one wished. The technical challenges were formidable, of course. Molten glass is not water or wine or any ordinary liquid that can be decanted at leisure. It cools rapidly upon contact with cooler surfaces, stiffening and solidifying even as it spreads. It must be kept at precisely the right temperature throughout the pouring process, hot enough to flow freely but not so hot that it becomes unworkably thin. The table onto which it is poured must be perfectly flat, perfectly smooth, perfectly level, or the resulting sheet will be warped and useless, and the glass once poured must be rolled flat with heavy metal cylinders before it has time to cool, spreading it to an even thickness across the entire surface of the table. Perrault worked on these problems for years, refining his techniques through countless experiments, countless failures, countless sheets of flawed or broken glass. By 1687, he had succeeded in producing flat glass by what he called the table casting method, pouring molten glass directly onto an iron surface and rolling it smooth. The results were remarkable. Where the Venetian method had been limited to mirrors of perhaps 40 inches in length, Perrault's cast glass could achieve double that dimension, 162 centimetres, or nearly 64 inches from a single pour. In September of 1688, the French crown granted him an exclusive privilege to practice his new art, recognising the significance of what he had achieved. But Perrault was not the only mind working on this problem, and the full realisation of cast glass would require contributions from others as well. In Normandy, at the glassworks of Tour-la-Ville, Louis Lucas de Nehu, the same family that had taken over from the failed Venetian defectors, was developing his own approach to the manufacture of large mirrors. Around 1688, the same year that Perrault received his privilege, Lucas de Nehu achieved a crucial breakthrough in the practical handling of the enormous quantities of hot glass that large-scale casting required. New crucibles, new pouring equipment, new techniques for managing the rapid transfer of molten material from furnace to casting plate. All of these innovations came together in the Norman workshops, making possible what had previously been only theory. The Compagnie de Plastrier, which would later become the Compagnie Saint-Gobain, recognised the potential of these new methods and moved quickly to consolidate control. In 1695, the company obtained exclusive rights to manufacture glass using the casting technique, even going so far as to seize Perrault's equipment and bring his innovations under their own roof. This was another kind of monopoly, different from Venice's but no less determined in its ambitions. The secrets of cast glass, like the secrets of blown glass before them, would be guarded and controlled and exploited for maximum advantage. But there was a crucial difference between the new French monopoly and the old Venetian one. The cast glass technique was not merely an improvement on what had come before. It was a fundamental reimagining of what mirrors could be. The pouring process allowed the production of plate glass mirrors measuring at least 60 inches by 40 inches, dimensions that would have been physically impossible under the Venetian method regardless of how skilled the craftsman or how pure the materials, and the mirrors that had decorated the gallery of the Royal Palace of Versailles since 1684. Those 357 panels that stretched the length of that 73-metre hall represented the first fruits of this new capability. The irony was rich and deep. France had gone to extraordinary lengths to steal Venice's mirror-making secrets, had dispatched spies and recruited defectors and weathered assassination attempts and diplomatic crises, all in the service of breaking a monopoly that had seemed unassailable. And yet the very success of that espionage campaign had set in motion developments that made the stolen secrets almost immediately obsolete. The Venetian method, perfected over centuries and guarded with such ruthlessness, was simply incapable of producing the enormous panels that the new French technique could achieve. Colbert's great victory had been, in a sense, unnecessary. Or rather, it had been necessary only as a stepping stone to something far more significant than mere imitation. This is often the way with technological progress, though we rarely see it so clearly as in the history of the mirror. The effort to copy an existing technique, to match what another has already achieved, frequently leads not to simple replication but to innovation that surpasses the original entirely. The French had set out to become Venice's equals in mirror making. They ended by becoming Venice's superiors in ways that Venice could never match. The blown cylinder, the culmination of Murini's craft, was simply unable to compete with the poured table, however skilled the breath that inflated it, or however pure the cristallo from which it was made. And so the stage was set for a transformation in the mirror trade that would ripple outward through the centuries to come. The enormous cast panels of Saint-Gobain would find their way into palaces and mansions across Europe, their unprecedented size becoming itself a mark of status and modernity. The Venetian masters, for all their accumulated skill, would find themselves increasingly marginalised, their traditional methods unable to match the scale that the new technique made possible. The gilded cage of Murano had been breached not merely by theft but by obsolescence, by the discovery that there were better ways to make a mirror than anything the island's craftsmen had ever imagined. But all of this, the cast glass and the Saint-Gobain monopoly, and the spread of enormous mirrors through the palaces of Europe, all of this took place on the surface of a darker story that we have not yet examined. For while ministers plotted and workshops competed and techniques evolved, the human beings who actually made the mirrors were being slowly destroyed by the very materials they worked with. And it is to that hidden toll that we now turn, pausing the grand narrative of nations and monopolies to look more closely at what the mirror trade was doing to the bodies of those who practiced it. The tin mercury amalgam that gave mirrors their reflective backing was, as we have seen, a closely guarded secret of the Venetian craft. The precise proportions of tin to mercury, the exact temperature at which they were combined, the technique of floating the molten amalgam beneath the glass and bonding it to the surface. All of these were mysteries that the Council of Ten had worked so diligently to protect. But there was another secret embedded in this process, one that the masters of Murano surely knew but rarely spoke of aloud. The secret was this: mercury is a poison, and the men who worked with it were being poisoned, slowly and inexorably, with every day they spent at their trade. Mercury vapour is invisible. It has almost no smell, no taste, no warning signs that might alert the unwary to its presence. At room temperature, liquid mercury evaporates continuously, releasing molecules into the air that are absorbed through the lungs with every breath. And once inside the body, mercury accumulates. It lodges in the brain, in the kidneys, in the liver. It does not pass through or flush out or dissipate with time. It builds day after day, breath after breath, until the burden becomes too great for the body to bear. The symptoms begin subtly. A slight tremor in the hands, barely noticeable at first, perhaps attributed to fatigue or age or simple nervousness. Difficulty concentrating, a tendency to lose the thread of a conversation or forget what one was about to say. Irritability that seems out of proportion to its causes. Flashes of anger or frustration that surprise even the person experiencing them. These early signs might be dismissed, explained away, attributed to the ordinary stresses of a demanding craft. But they do not improve. They worsen, gradually and inexorably, as the mercury continues to accumulate. The tremors spread from the hands to the arms to the head, making fine work increasingly difficult for craftsmen whose livelihood depended on precision. Memory loss deepens, short-term recall becoming unreliable, and gaps appearing in the fabric of daily experience. The affected person may begin to experience vivid and disturbing dreams, their sleep becoming troubled and unrefreshing. Depression sets in, a persistent lowness of spirit that seems to have no external cause and no remedy. And in the most severe cases, the personality itself begins to fragment, the sufferer becoming confused, paranoid, delusional, unable to distinguish reality from imagination. This constellation of symptoms would later become known as erethism or mercurial erethism, from the Greek word for irritation or excitement. It was the occupational disease of mirror makers, of hatters who used mercury in the felting process, of gilders and instrument makers, and all the other tradesmen whose crafts brought them into regular contact with the silver liquid. The phrase mad as a hatter, which would enter English usage in the 19th century, referred to exactly this phenomenon. The well-known tendency of workers in certain trades to develop neurological symptoms that resembled madness, but had their origin in poisoning rather than disease. And the mirror makers of Murano, those pampered and imprisoned craftsmen whom we have followed through so many chapters of this story, were among the most heavily exposed workers in all of Europe. The tin-mercury amalgam process required them to handle liquid mercury in large quantities, to heat it until it vaporized and combined with the tin, to work in enclosed spaces where the invisible fumes accumulated with nowhere to disperse. The reflecting layer that resulted from this process consisted of approximately 75% tin and 25% mercury, and that mercury continued to off-gas from the finished mirror for years after its manufacture, though in diminishing quantities. As early as 1713, the ill effects of mercury vapour on mirror makers were well documented on the island of Murano. Observers reported that the craftsmen could be seen cursing the trade they have adopted, lamenting the fate that had led them into a profession that was slowly destroying their minds and bodies. The tremors, the memory loss, the irritability and depression, all were recognised as consequences of the work, as occupational hazards that came with the territory of mirror making. And yet the work continued, because mirrors were valuable, and the men who could make them were valuable in turn, however damaged they might become over time. This was the hidden economy of the mirror trade, the accounting that never appeared in the ledgers of the merchants or the calculations of the ministers. Every mirror that left Murano for the palaces of Europe carried within it not merely the skill of its makers, but something of their health, their vitality, their sanity. The reflection that showed a nobleman his own face had been purchased, in part, with the deteriorating memories and trembling hands of men who would never see the inside of any palace, who spent their working lives in the heat and fumes of the glass furnaces, breathing poison with every breath. And the French, when they succeeded in breaking the Venetian monopoly, inherited this dark bargain along with the techniques and the trade secrets. The workers at the royal manufacture of mirrors, whether Venetian defectors or French apprentices, laboured under the same conditions and suffered the same consequences as their counterparts in Murano. The mercury did not care what flag flew over the workshop or what language the craftsmen spoke. It accumulated in their bodies just the same, exacting its toll with the same slow inevitability, turning skilled hands tremulous and sharp minds clouded. The death of that mirror polisher in 1667, the one who succumbed to stomach symptoms that the Venetians may or may not have induced through poison. We will never know for certain what killed him, but it is worth noting that stomach complaints were also among the documented effects of mercury exposure, that the substance attacked the digestive system as readily as the nervous system. The man might have been assassinated, as the French suspected, or he might simply have been another victim of his trade, his body giving out under the accumulated burden of years spent working with toxic materials. In the end, the distinction mattered less than the fact of his death, another life consumed in the service of producing beauty for those who would never know its true cost. And the true cost was being paid across Europe, in every workshop where mirrors were made. The trembling hands of the Venetian masters, the clouded minds of the French apprentices, the shortened lives and damaged families of all those who entered the trade. These were the prices that underwrote the mirror's magic. The queen who admired her reflection in a Venetian glass, the king who walked the length of the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the nobleman who commissioned a mirror as large as the new casting techniques could produce. None of them saw the workers who had made these wonders possible, and none of them asked what the making had cost. There is something particularly bitter in this arrangement, something that troubles the conscience even across the span of centuries. The mirror's whole purpose is to show us ourselves, to reflect our image back to our own eyes with perfect fidelity, and yet the very process that made this self-reflection possible was hidden from view, its human costs deliberately obscured, its victims invisible to those who benefited from their labour. The mirror showed everything except the truth of its own making. It reflected surfaces but concealed depths. This concealment was not accidental. The merchants who sold mirrors had no interest in advertising the damage that their manufacture caused. The councils and ministers who controlled the trade had no reason to publicise the suffering of the workers who produced their most valuable export. And the workers themselves, trapped in their gilded cages or recruited into foreign workshops, had little power to tell their own stories or demand better conditions. They laboured in obscurity, and in obscurity they sickened and died, their fates of concern to no one except perhaps their own families. It would take more than a century for a fundamental solution to emerge. In 1835, a German chemist named Justus von Liebig developed a method of depositing metallic silver onto glass surfaces, creating a reflective backing that required no mercury whatsoever. This silvering process, as it came to be called, would eventually replace the tin-mercury amalgam entirely, making mirrors both safer to produce and clearer in their reflection. But for all the generations of mirror makers who came before, for the craftsmen of Murano and the defectors who fled to France, and the apprentices who learned the trade in workshops across Europe, there was no such rescue. They breathed the mercury vapour because there was no other way to make a mirror, and they paid the price that the mercury demanded. The steady current of progress continued to flow, carrying the mirror trade forward into new eras and new techniques. But the bodies of the workers remained behind, buried in the churchyards of Murano and Paris and Orléans, their graves unmarked by any monument to what they had suffered. The mirrors they made still exist, some of them, in museums and palaces and private collections. The surfaces still reflect, a little dimmer now perhaps than when they were new, but still functional, still doing what mirrors have always done. And somewhere in that reflection, invisible but indelible, is the presence of the men who made them, their skill and their sacrifice, their shortened lives and trembling hands, the price they paid so that others might see themselves. The river keeps flowing, the trade keeps evolving, and the costs, though we may forget them, remain embedded in the objects we have inherited from the past. Every reflection carries within it this history, this memory of what was given so that we might see ourselves clearly. The face that looks back at us from the mirror is our own, but the means by which we see it was purchased with the health and lives of workers whose names we will never know, whose suffering was considered an acceptable cost of progress, whose bodies were consumed so that beauty might exist. And still there was more to come, more transformations and more costs, more unfolding of consequences from choices made in workshops and councils and palaces. The mirror was not finished with its changes, nor were the societies that had learned to produce it. The religious implications of widespread self-reflection, the philosophical questions raised by the democratization of the mirror, the slow decline of Venice as its monopoly crumbled and its secrets spread, all of these developments lay ahead, waiting to be explored. But for now we pause here, in this moment of reckoning, acknowledging what had been sacrificed and what had been gained. The cast glass techniques continued to improve. The Saint-Gobain workshops continued to produce their enormous panels. The courts of Europe continued to fill with mirrors of unprecedented size and clarity. And the mercury, that invisible poison, continued to exact its toll, year after year, generation after generation, until finally a better method was found. The story of the mirror is a story of human ingenuity and human cruelty, of beauty created through suffering, of progress purchased at prices that were rarely acknowledged and never fully paid. It is a story worth remembering, even as we gaze into mirrors that no longer carry the same costs, even as we take for granted the reflection that once required such terrible sacrifices to achieve. And yet, even as the mercury continued to claim its victims in workshops across Europe, something else was happening, something that would prove just as transformative as the technical innovations that had made mirrors more affordable and more widely available. The mirror was changing how people thought about themselves, not just how they dressed or arranged their hair, but how they understood the very nature of personal identity, the boundaries of the self, the relationship between the face one showed to the world and the person who existed behind that face. To understand this transformation, we must step back from the workshops and the diplomatic intrigues and consider what it meant in practical terms for ordinary people to suddenly have access to clear, accurate reflections of their own faces. For most of human history, the vast majority of people had only the vaguest sense of what they looked like. They might catch a glimpse of themselves in still water or in the polished surface of a metal pan, but these reflections were fleeting and imperfect, offering only rough approximations of the features that others saw when they looked at you. Your face, in a very real sense, belonged more to other people than it did to you. They were the ones who saw it clearly, who could describe it accurately, who knew its contours and expressions better than you ever could. The mirror changed all of that. By the late 17th century, as French production drove prices steadily downward and mirrors became fixtures in bourgeois homes across Europe. Increasing numbers of people could study their own faces with the same clarity that had once been reserved for the very wealthy. They could watch themselves smile, frown, speak, age. They could observe the subtle shifts in their expressions, the way their features changed with emotional fatigue, the gradual accumulation of lines and marks that recorded the passage of time. For the first time in human history, the face became truly one's own, a possession that could be examined, evaluated, and cultivated with the same attention that one might give to any other aspect of personal presentation. The effects of this transformation are perhaps most visible in the realm of art, and no artist embodies this shift more dramatically than Rembrandt van Rijn. Over the course of his career, from the early 1620s until his death in 1669, Rembrandt created an astonishing body of self-portraits, approaching 100 in total, including over 40 paintings, 31 etchings, and roughly 7 drawings. This was an enormously high number for any artist up to that point, a quantity so far beyond the norm that it demands explanation. By comparison, the highly prolific Peter Paul Rubens, one of the most celebrated and productive painters of the age, created only 7 self-portrait paintings in his entire career. What was Rembrandt doing that required him to turn the brush upon himself so many times? The answer lies partly in practical matters. A painter working alone could hardly find a more available or patient model than his own reflection, but it extends far beyond mere convenience. Rembrandt was not simply recording his appearance for posterity or practicing his technique. He was conducting an extended investigation into the nature of selfhood, using the mirror as both tool and subject, exploring the question of what it meant to be a particular person moving through time. His early self-portraits show a young man experimenting with expressions and poses, trying on different identities like costumes. His middle period works reveal an artist at the height of his powers, confident and accomplished. And his late self-portraits, those extraordinary paintings from the final decade of his life, present a face that has been weathered by time and misfortune, a gaze that seems to look both outward at the viewer and inward at something beyond the reach of any mirror. What Rembrandt understood, and what his paintings demonstrate with unprecedented clarity, was that the self is not a fixed thing, but a process, a continuous becoming that unfolds through time. The mirror made this visible in a way that had never been possible before. You could look at your reflection and see not just who you were in this moment, but who you had been and who you were becoming. The face accumulated experience, recorded history, testified to the passage of years in ways that were now available for examination and reflection. It was no coincidence that this same period, the latter half of the 17th century and the early decades of the 18th, saw some of the most consequential developments in the philosophical understanding of personal identity. The questions that Rembrandt was exploring through paint and canvas were being addressed in a different register by philosophers who were grappling with what it meant to be a self that persisted through time, that changed, yet somehow remained the same, that was both observer and observed. The domestic mirror became increasingly common among the bourgeois classes, who cultivated the trend toward everyday household use as the technology grew more affordable. This was not merely a matter of vanity or decoration, though it certainly served those purposes as well. Part of the allure of mirrors was that they provided additional lighting, reflecting and multiplying the glow of candles and lamps, as well as a perceived extension of space, making rooms seem larger and more open than their actual dimensions. These practical benefits corresponded to a general artistic and intellectual focus on light and optics during the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, an era when scientists were developing new instruments for seeing and measuring, when painters were obsessed with the representation of light, when the relationship between appearance and reality was being questioned and investigated on multiple fronts. The mirror fit seamlessly into this broader cultural preoccupation. It was an instrument of illumination in both the literal and the metaphorical sense, a tool for seeing more clearly and for reflecting upon what was seen. The face that looked back at you from the mirror was undeniably your own, and yet it was also somehow separate from you, an image that existed outside your body, a representation that could be studied and evaluated as though it belonged to someone else. This doubling effect, the simultaneous identification with and separation from one's own reflection, raised questions that philosophers would spend centuries trying to answer. What makes you the same person today that you were yesterday? If every cell in your body is eventually replaced, if your memories fade and your opinions change and your face gradually transforms into something that would be unrecognizable to your younger self, in what sense do you persist as a continuous identity? These questions had been asked before, of course, but the widespread availability of mirrors gave them a new urgency and a new concreteness. You could watch yourself age. You could see the face that others saw when they looked at you. You could study the external manifestation of whatever it was that constituted your inner self, and you could wonder about the relationship between the two. The democratization of the mirror and the philosophical invention of the modern self were not coincidental developments that happened to occur at the same time. They were aspects of the same transformation, expressions of the same cultural moment when European thought was turning inward, when the individual was emerging as the fundamental unit of moral and political concern, when the question of who you were and how you knew yourself was becoming central to both art and philosophy. The mirror made visible what had previously been invisible, and in doing so, it changed what it meant to be a person. And while this transformation was unfolding in the studios of artists and the studies of philosophers, the economic landscape that had made it possible was itself undergoing a dramatic transformation. The Venetian monopoly that had once controlled Europe's mirror supply was crumbling, not in a single catastrophic collapse, but in a slow, inexorable decline that stretched across decades, carrying with it the fortunes of families that had grown wealthy over generations and the privileges of craftsmen who had once been among the most valued workers in Europe. From the 17th century onward, Murano glassmaking entered a period of gradual decay, driven by increasing competition from glassmakers in Bohemia and France. The techniques that the Council of Ten had guarded so jealously, the secrets that had been protected through surveillance and threats and assassination, were no longer secrets at all. Louis XIV had succeeded in luring Venetian craftsmen to Paris, and France had learned to make large, flawless mirrors, breaking Venice's monopoly once and for all. The cast glass methods developed by Bernard Perrault and refined by Louis-Lucas de Neuilly produced panels of a size and quality that Murano's traditional blown glass techniques could never match. But the decline was not merely technical. Economic difficulties and plague outbreaks hit Venice particularly hard toward the end of the 1600s, weakening the foundations of a trading empire that had once stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond. The plague of 1630 had been devastating, and the economic crises that followed further eroded Venice's position as a centre of commerce and manufacture. Meanwhile, Bohemian crystal was gaining popularity as a fierce competitor to Venetian glass, offering a different aesthetic and often at lower prices. Many master glassmakers, seeing the direction of the trade, chose to emigrate rather than remain in a declining industry, establishing workshops in France, the Netherlands and Germany that would compete directly with their former home. The Murano monopoly collapsed gradually rather than suddenly. The Republic had partially lost its exclusive control at the end of the 16th century, when some glassmakers had allowed the secrets to become known in other European countries. But the establishment of the French mirror industry and the development of cast glass techniques accelerated this decline dramatically. Where once a single Murano mirror might have cost as much as a Raphael painting, prices across European markets fell steadily between 1680 and 1720 as production increased and competition intensified. The mirrors themselves had not changed. They still reflected, still multiplied light, still offered that doubled image of the viewer's face, but their value had been transformed by the simple economic facts of supply and demand. For the maestros of Murano and their descendants, this transformation was experienced not as an abstract economic trend, but as a personal and familial catastrophe. For generations, these families had enjoyed privileged social status. Their daughters had been permitted to marry into the wealthiest Venetian families, binding the secrets of glassmaking to the fortunes of the nobility. Their sons had been encouraged to carry on the trade, inheriting both the technical knowledge and the social standing that came with membership in one of Europe's most exclusive crafts. The hereditary privilege that had once been their birthright had seemed as solid and enduring as the glass itself. Now that privilege was worthless. Unlike 500 years before, the children of glassmakers no longer enjoyed special status, extra wealth, or the prospect of marriage into nobility. The secrets their grandparents had guarded with their lives were now common knowledge in workshops from Paris to Prague. The skills that had once commanded princely sums now earned only ordinary wages, if they earned anything at all. The glass furnaces of Murano still burned, but they burned with diminished heat, producing goods that competed in an increasingly crowded market against rivals who had once been customers. The Grand Tour brought a new kind of visitor to Venice, young European aristocrats making the circuit of cultural sites that was considered essential to a gentleman's education. These wealthy travellers came to admire the art, to experience the famous carnivals, to soak in the atmosphere of a city that was already becoming a monument to its own past rather than a living centre of commerce and innovation. Glass objects became popular souvenirs, trinkets that visitors could take home as evidence of their travels and their taste. The glassblowers of Murano, whose predecessors had supplied the courts of kings and the halls of princes, now found themselves performing for tourists, demonstrating their craft for tips from travellers who regarded them as picturesque remnants of a bygone era. Napoleon's conquest in 1797 dealt another blow, abolishing the ancient guilds that had structured Venetian industry for centuries. The transfer of Venice to Habsburg rule in 1814 raised costs prohibitively, and by 1820 almost half of Murano's 24 furnaces had shut down entirely. The island that had once held Europe's most guarded industrial secret had become a shadow of its former self, its glory days receding into history, its workers struggling to maintain traditions that the modern world seemed determined to render obsolete. And yet, even as Venice declined, the mirror continued its expansion across the globe, carried by the same currents of trade and diplomacy and conquest that were reshaping the entire world. The object that had once been a closely guarded luxury, restricted to the wealthiest courts of Europe, was now spreading to markets and palaces far beyond the boundaries of Christendom, carrying with it assumptions and implications that would prove as transformative as the reflection itself. Venice had long maintained diplomatic and commercial relationships with the Ottoman Empire, and among the gifts that Venetian ambassadors brought to Constantinople, mirrors held a place of special value. In 1579, considerable amounts of Murano glass and mirrors were shipped to Constantinople, valued at 34,000 ducats, along with shipments to Alexandria and Egypt valued at 26,000 ducats, and to Syria and Aleppo at 23,000 ducats. This represented nearly 1/3 of Venice's total glass exports, a staggering proportion that testified to the demand for Venetian luxury goods among the wealthy elites of the Ottoman world. In Venetian homes, mirrors hung in nearly every room, reflecting their cultural centrality in Renaissance Europe. But the mirrors that travelled east carried with them a set of assumptions about seeing and being seen that did not necessarily translate across cultural boundaries. The Ottoman harem, that enclosed world of women and eunuchs that featured so prominently in European fantasies about the East, received Venetian mirrors as gifts of extraordinary value, objects that would have been displayed and admired and used for purposes that their makers could hardly have imagined. Farther west, across the Atlantic, the Spanish conquistadors carried mirrors into a world that had never seen such objects before. The Aztec Empire faced not only military engagement, but also psychological manipulation during the Spanish conquest. The Spanish approach involved a calculated game of perception and influence, employing propaganda, fear, and division to weaken Aztec resolve. Firearms gave the Spanish a psychological advantage beyond their purely military effectiveness, and the strangeness of European technology, including the polished metal and glass that the newcomers carried, contributed to the atmosphere of uncertainty and dread that preceded the actual fighting. The mirror in these encounters was never a neutral object. It carried with it European ideas about the visible self, about the relationship between appearance and identity, about the importance of the individual face as a locus of personhood. These ideas were not universal. Different cultures had different ways of understanding reflection, different traditions around water and polished surfaces and the meaning of the image that looked back at you. The spread of the European mirror was not simply the spread of a technology, but the spread of a particular way of seeing, a particular set of assumptions about what it meant to have a face, and to know what that face looked like. The rivers of trade and conquest continued to flow, carrying mirrors to markets that the glassmakers of Murano could never have imagined. The workshops of Saint-Gobain continued to produce their enormous panels, supplying the palaces of Europe and the homes of the bourgeoisie, and the cargo holds of ships bound for every corner of the trading world. The techniques continued to improve, the prices continued to fall, and the reflection continued its slow democratization, becoming available to more and more people, shaping the way they thought about themselves and their place in the world, and still the mercury continued to claim its victims in every workshop where the old amalgam method was practiced, year after year, generation after generation, until Liebig's silvering process finally offered an alternative. The workers who made the mirrors still suffered, still trembled, still died before their time, their sacrifice embedded in every reflection that travellers carried across oceans and continents. The beauty of the object was inseparable from the cost of its production, and that cost was paid not just in coin but in human lives, in shortened years and damaged bodies, in the quiet suffering of craftsmen whose names were never recorded and whose deaths went unmarked by any monument. The face in the mirror looked back serene and untroubled by the history that had made it visible. The viewer saw only themselves, only their own features reflected in the silvered glass, unaware of the chains of consequence that stretched backward through time to Murano and Paris and Orléans, to the workshops where mercury vapour hung in the air and men grew old before their time. The mirror offered clarity, offered light, offered the modern self its own face to examine and contemplate, and it asked nothing in return, demanded no acknowledgement of what had been sacrificed, required no reckoning with the true price of reflection. The centuries continued to pass. The techniques continued to improve. The mirror became so common, so ordinary, so utterly taken for granted that it was difficult to imagine a world without it. Difficult to remember that there had ever been a time when seeing your own face clearly was a luxury beyond the reach of ordinary people. The transformation was complete, or nearly so. What had once required the secrets of Venetian masters, what had once cost as much as a merchant ship, what had once been guarded with threats of imprisonment and death, was now a commonplace household object that could be purchased for a few coins in any market town in Europe. And still the river flowed, carrying the story forward toward new developments and new reckonings. The world that the mirror had helped to create, the world of the individual self, of the examined face, of the person who knew their own appearance as intimately as any other fact of their existence, continued to evolve, continued to grapple with the implications of what it meant to see yourself clearly. The glass still reflected, the light still bounced back from silvered surfaces, and somewhere in that reflection, invisible but always present, was the long history that had made this ordinary miracle possible, the secrets and the sacrifices, the espionage and the poisoning, the rise and fall of fortunes and the steady accumulation of human cost that lay behind every clear image of a human face. The mirror became so ordinary that we stopped seeing it at all. It hung on bathroom walls and bedroom doors, it folded into compacts and fitted into purses, it lined the interiors of automobiles and the lobbies of office buildings, and no one paused to consider the centuries of secrecy and suffering that had made it possible. The reflection simply appeared, as natural as breathing, as unremarkable as the morning light. A child growing up in the 20th century encountered mirrors so frequently that the experience of seeing their own face became indistinguishable from the experience of having a face at all. The two merged into one continuous awareness, and the strangeness of self-recognition, the peculiar miracle of looking at a surface and understanding that the image there was you, was the same person who was doing the looking, faded into the background noise of ordinary existence. And yet the strangeness remained, even if we had stopped noticing it. The capacity to recognize oneself in a mirror is not a universal feature of consciousness, not a given that comes automatically with having eyes and a brain. It is in fact remarkably rare in the animal kingdom, a cognitive achievement that most species never attain, no matter how sophisticated their other abilities might be. In 1970, an American psychologist named Gordon Gallup Jr. developed a simple test to measure this capacity, and in doing so revealed something profound about the nature of self-awareness and the peculiar position that humans occupy in the hierarchy of minds. The test was elegant in its simplicity. An animal would be anesthetized and marked with a spot of odorless dye or a small sticker on a part of its body that it could not normally see, the forehead perhaps, or the ear. When the animal awoke and was given access to a mirror, the question was straightforward. Would it recognize that the mark was on its own body and attempt to examine or remove it? Or would it treat the reflection as it would any other animal, as a stranger or a potential rival or simply an irrelevant feature of the environment? The results were humbling. Most animals failed the test entirely. Dogs, cats, birds, fish, creatures that humans had lived alongside for thousands of years, creatures that seemed in so many ways to possess rich inner lives and complex behaviours, showed no sign of understanding that the image in the mirror was themselves. They might bark at it, or ignore it, or investigate it briefly before losing interest, but they did not reach up to touch the mark on their own bodies, did not demonstrate that crucial leap of understanding that connected the reflection to the self. A handful of species passed. Chimpanzees and orangutans, our closest evolutionary relatives, consistently demonstrated mirror self-recognition, examining the marks on their faces and bodies with clear awareness that they were looking at themselves. Bottlenose dolphins passed the test, approaching the mirror and twisting their bodies to examine marked areas. Elephants passed, using their trunks to investigate marks they could only see in the reflection. And in a surprising result that expanded the boundaries of what scientists thought possible, magpies, corvids with brains structured entirely differently from mammals, also passed, scratching at marks placed on their feathers. Beyond these few species, the capacity for mirror self-recognition appears to be vanishingly rare. The vast majority of animals on Earth live their entire lives without ever understanding that the face in the water or the polished surface is their own. They see without seeing themselves, exist without the peculiar burden of self-awareness that humans carry from the moment they first pass the mirror test, usually around 18 months of age. What does it mean to be one of the few creatures on Earth capable of this recognition? What does it mean to look at a surface and understand, with immediate and intuitive certainty, that the image there is you, that the eyes looking back are your eyes, that the expression is your expression, that the aging you observe is your aging? The question has occupied philosophers for centuries, but the mirror test suggests that the capacity itself is not a philosophical abstraction, but a concrete cognitive achievement, something that either happens or does not happen, something that separates the self-aware from the merely aware. And here is where the long history of the mirror circles back to meet the present moment. For thousands of years, the mirror was a rare and precious object, available only to the wealthy and the powerful, encountered infrequently even by those who could afford it. The ordinary person might catch a glimpse of their reflection in still water or polished metal a few times in their life, but the sustained, daily, intimate encounter with one's own face that we now take for granted was simply not part of the human experience for most of human history. The mirror test, had it existed in ancient times, would have been an abstraction. Most people would have had little opportunity to develop the kind of relationship with their reflected image that the test assumes. The democratization of the mirror changed this. As prices fell and production increased, as the secrets of Venice spread across Europe, and the techniques continued to improve, more and more people gained access to clear, accurate reflections of their own faces. The experience of mirror self-recognition, once rare and fleeting, became a daily occurrence. People began to know their own appearances with an intimacy that would have been impossible in earlier centuries, to track the changes in their faces over time, to develop what we might call a relationship with their reflected selves. And then, in the early 21st century, something happened that the glassmakers of Murano could never have anticipated. The mirror multiplied. It became portable, became ubiquitous, became not just a household object, but a constant companion carried in every pocket and purse. The smartphone arrived, and with it the front-facing camera, and suddenly the capacity for self-reflection was available not just in bathrooms and bedrooms, but everywhere, at every moment, in every situation. The mirror had escaped the wall entirely and become a feature of daily life so pervasive that it was possible to check one's own reflection dozens of times per day without any conscious intention to do so. The front-facing camera was not, strictly speaking, a mirror. It captured images rather than simply reflecting light, and those images could be stored, shared, examined, compared, and curated in ways that no mirror had ever permitted. But it served the same fundamental function. It showed you your own face, allowed you to see yourself as others might see you, enabled the kind of sustained self-examination that the mirror had first made possible, and it did so with a frequency and intensity that dwarfed anything the mirror had ever offered. Consider what this meant for a generation that came of age with these devices. A teenager in the 21st century might encounter their own face in a screen hundreds of times per week. checking their appearance before a photo, reviewing images after they were taken, scrolling through feeds filled with carefully curated images of others, comparing their own faces to the faces they saw online. The experience of self-recognition that Gordon Gallup had measured with his simple test had become not just a cognitive capacity, but a constant preoccupation, a loop of looking and being looked at that ran continuously through the waking hours. The research began to accumulate and the findings were troubling. Studies showed that heavy use of social media, particularly platforms that emphasized images and appearance, was correlated with increased rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and suicidal ideation. The correlations were especially strong among younger users, and strongest of all among adolescent girls. The act of comparing oneself to others, of seeking validation through likes and comments, of curating one's appearance for an audience of peers and strangers, appeared to be taking a measurable toll on mental health. The mechanisms were complex and not fully understood, but certain patterns emerged. Passive scrolling through others' content, simply looking at images of other people's faces and bodies without engaging, triggered harmful peer comparison and body dissatisfaction. The desire for validation through external feedback created a cycle of seeking approval that was never quite satisfied. The gap between one's actual appearance and the carefully filtered, carefully lit, carefully posed images that populated social media feeds generated feelings of inadequacy that no amount of self-improvement could resolve. The mirror that the smartphone offered was not neutral. It was designed to be engaging, to capture attention, to encourage repeated use, and the psychological effects of this engagement were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Younger women reported the strongest links between selfie engagement and appearance anxiety. The act of taking and sharing images of one's own face, which might seem like a simple extension of the mirror's ancient function, turned out to carry psychological costs that the mirror itself had never imposed. The difference was partly one of degree, the sheer frequency of self-examination that the smartphone enabled, but it was also one of kind. The mirror had always been a private encounter, a moment between the self and its reflection. The smartphone camera was inherently social, inherently comparative, inherently oriented toward an audience whose judgment was both desired and feared. And beneath these specific findings lay a deeper question, one that the long history of the mirror made it possible to ask. The capacity for self-recognition that Gallup had measured, the capacity that separated humans from most other animals, the capacity that the mirror had amplified and the smartphone had intensified, was it a gift or a burden? Was seeing yourself clearly a form of self-knowledge that enriched human life, or was it a trap that generated endless dissatisfaction, endless comparison, endless striving toward an ideal that could never be reached? The question had no simple answer, but the history suggested that it was at least worth asking. The Venetian masters who had perfected the mirror had done so in pursuit of profit and prestige, not in pursuit of human flourishing. The French spies who had stolen their secrets had been motivated by national ambition, not by concern for the psychological welfare of future generations. The mercury-poisoned workers who had trembled and died in workshops across Europe had not consented to sacrifice their health so that others might see themselves more clearly. At every stage, the mirror had been a product of human ambition and human suffering, shaped by forces that had nothing to do with what was good for the people who would eventually use it. And now, in the 21st century, the mirror had been engineered again, not by glassmakers, but by software developers, not with mercury and tin, but with algorithms and interfaces. The social media platforms that delivered endless images of faces to endless screens were not designed to promote self-knowledge or psychological health. They were designed to maximize engagement, to capture attention, to generate the kind of compulsive use that translated into advertising revenue. The mirror had become, once again, a political object, shaped by economic interests that had nothing to do with the welfare of the people who looked into it. The neuroscientists studying mirror self-recognition had revealed something profound about the human condition. We are among the very few creatures on Earth capable of seeing ourselves. But the history of the mirror revealed something equally profound. The surfaces in which we see ourselves have always been shaped by forces beyond our control, have always carried costs that were hidden from the viewer, have always been political objects masquerading as neutral tools. The face in the glass looked back, serene and untroubled, and asked nothing of the viewer, but the viewer, had they known the full history, might have asked a great deal of the face. The river flowed, as it always had, carrying the story toward its end. The workshops of Saint-Gobain had long since abandoned the mercury amalgam, and the trembling hands of poisoned craftsmen had passed out of living memory. The secrets of Murano had become common knowledge, available in any chemistry textbook, and the death penalty that had once guarded them seemed like a relic of a barbaric age. The mirror had completed its long journey from luxury to commodity, from wonder to wallpaper, from the treasure of kings to the most ordinary of household objects, and yet, consider the craftsman Girolamo Barberin, who reached Versailles in 1675 and worked on the Hall of Mirrors even as the Serenissima condemned him to death in absentia. His exceptional skill eventually earned him a pardon, and he was permitted to return home to Murano, one of the few defectors to survive both the dangers of flight and the dangers of return. Consider the master known only as Peter the Venetian, who fled his island and brought his knowledge directly to the court of Louis XIV, trading his secrets for a new life in a foreign land. Consider the unnamed workers who died of mercury poisoning in the workshops of Paris and Orléans, whose trembling hands polished the glass that would hang in the Hall of Mirrors, whose shortened lives were the hidden cost of every gleaming panel. The hall itself still stands, its 357 mirrors still reflecting the light that streams through its 17 windows, its 73 meters of gallery still drawing visitors from around the world. Each grand mirror is actually composed of 21 smaller pieces, 15 square panels in the main section, 3 curved panels on top, and 3 connecting strips between them. A technical achievement that represented the cutting edge of 17th century glassmaking. The mirrors were technologically advanced and enormously costly, the product of decades of espionage and innovation, the trophy of a broken monopoly and the symbol of French ambition. They reflected the Sun King in all his glory, multiplied his image across the length of the gallery, created the illusion of infinite space and infinite light. And behind every reflection, invisible but always present, was the long chain of sacrifice that had made it possible. The workers who had breathed mercury vapour until their hands shook and their minds clouded, the defectors who had risked death to carry secrets across borders, the families held hostage on Murano, threatened with ruin if their fathers and husbands did not return, the poisoned meals and the threatening letters and the assassins dispatched to silence those who talked too freely. The mirror was never just glass and metal, never just a neutral surface for reflection. It was always a political object, always shaped by power and profit, always carrying costs that the viewer was not meant to see. The same is true today, though the costs have changed. The smartphone camera that shows you your face 100 times a day was not designed for your benefit. The algorithms that curate your feed, that decide which images you see and which you do not, that learn your preferences and exploit your vulnerabilities, these are not neutral tools for self-knowledge. They are political objects shaped by economic interests, carrying psychological costs that are only beginning to be measured and understood. The trembling hands of the mercury-poisoned craftsman have been replaced by the anxious scrolling of the adolescent comparing herself to filtered images, but the fundamental dynamic remains. The mirror is made by someone, for some purpose, and the person who looks into it rarely knows the full cost of what they see. The face in the water rippled and reformed, as it had in the beginning, before any mirror existed. The first humans who bent over still pools and saw their own features looking back could not have imagined what would follow. The obsidian discs and the bronze circles, the Venetian secrets and the French espionage, the mercury poisoning and the smartphone algorithms, they saw only themselves, only that strange doubling of consciousness that occurs when the looker becomes the looked at, when the subject becomes the object of its own gaze. The experience must have been unsettling, must have raised questions that had no answers, must have opened a door in the human mind that could never quite be closed again. We are the inheritors of that opened door. We live in a world saturated with reflective surfaces, a world where seeing yourself is not a rare and precious experience, but a constant background hum. A world where the mirror has multiplied beyond anything the glassmakers of Murano could have conceived. We carry mirrors in our pockets, hang them on our walls, encounter them in every public space, and we rarely pause to consider what it means to be creatures who see ourselves so constantly, so intimately, so inescapably. The few other animals who pass the mirror test, the chimpanzees and dolphins, the elephants and magpies, do not live in worlds designed around reflection. They encounter mirrors only in laboratory settings, only under controlled conditions, only for the brief duration of an experiment. Their self-recognition, remarkable as it is, remains a latent capacity rather than a defining feature of their daily experience. They are not shaped by the mirror the way we are shaped by it, do not carry the burden of constant self-scrutiny that has become the birthright of every human being in the developed world. Perhaps this is what Venice should have kept locked on the island. Not the technical secrets of cristallo glass and mercury amalgam, not the formulas and the furnace temperatures and the precise ratios of ingredients. These would have leaked eventually, as all secrets do, carried by defectors and spies in the simple passage of time. What Venice could not keep locked was the deeper secret, the one that the mirror revealed to everyone who looked into it, that you have a face, that you can see it, that you can study it and judge it and compare it to other faces, that you can watch it age and change and eventually decay. This knowledge, once released, could not be taken back. It spread across Europe and then across the world, reshaping the way human beings understood themselves and their place in the universe. The mirror was always a trap as much as a gift. It offered knowledge that came with a cost, clarity that carried a burden. The Venetian masters who perfected it were not philosophers concerned with the nature of self-awareness. They were craftsmen and merchants pursuing profit and prestige. But the object they created had implications far beyond their intentions, shaped the development of Western individualism, contributed to the emergence of the modern self, and eventually evolved into the algorithmic mirrors of the digital age that now extract such a heavy psychological toll. The river still flows, as it always has, carrying the story forward into futures that no one can predict. The techniques will continue to improve, the costs will continue to fall, and new forms of reflection will emerge that we cannot yet imagine. Perhaps the smartphone camera will seem as quaint to future generations as the bronze disc seems to us, a primitive technology superseded by something more immersive, more constant, more inescapable. Perhaps the psychological harms that researchers are now documenting will deepen, or perhaps humanity will find ways to adapt, to develop new relationships with reflection that are healthier and more sustainable. The story is not over. It is never over, but the history matters. The face in the mirror looks back, serene and untroubled, and asks nothing of the viewer. But we might ask something of it. We might ask who made this surface and at what cost. We might ask whose hands trembled and whose lungs filled with vapour so that we could see ourselves so clearly. We might ask what purposes are served by the algorithms that curate our reflections and whose interests are advanced by our constant self-scrutiny. We might ask whether the gift of self-recognition, that rare capacity that separates us from most other animals, has been turned against us by those who profit from our insecurity. The craftsmen of Murano were not permitted to look away. They were bound to their island, forbidden to leave, condemned to death if they carried their secrets elsewhere. They worked the furnaces and breathed the fumes and made the mirrors that would transform the world, and they had no choice in the matter. Their skills were too valuable to be allowed freedom, their knowledge too dangerous to be permitted escape. They were prisoners of the very beauty they created, trapped by the value of what they knew. And neither now are we permitted to look away. The mirrors surround us, multiply us, reflect us back to ourselves 1,000 times a day. The algorithms learn our faces and our preferences, track our engagement and our anxiety, optimize for attention and profit without regard for our welfare. The capacity for self-recognition that makes us human has been captured and commodified, turned into a tool for extraction rather than a pathway to self-knowledge. We look into the glass because we cannot help it, because the surfaces are everywhere, because the technology has been designed to be irresistible. The face in the water ripples and reforms. The face in the obsidian disc stares back, dark and mysterious. The face in the Venetian mirror gleams with unprecedented clarity, purchased at a price that was never disclosed. The face in the smartphone screen scrolls and filters and compares, seeking validation that is never quite enough. It is all the same face, and it is all the same question. Who are you, and what does it cost to know? The river flows on, carrying the mercury and the secrets and the trembling hands, carrying the algorithms and the anxiety and the endless images. The mirror reflects as it always has, showing us ourselves whether we wish to see or not. And somewhere in that reflection, invisible but always present, is the long history that made this ordinary miracle possible. The death sentences and the defections, the poisonings and the espionage, the rise and fall of monopolies and the steady accumulation of human cost. The face looks back. It does not blink. It does not turn away. And neither now can we. The lights are low now, and the story has reached its end. The river that began in still water and polished obsidian has flowed through bronze and glass and mercury, through Venice and Paris and Versailles, through centuries of secrecy and sacrifice, and has arrived at last in the palm of your hand, in the screen that glows beside your bed, in the reflection that waits for you every morning when you wake. Take a slow breath now. Feel the soft weight of the covers, the gentle darkness of the room. The mirror will still be there tomorrow, as it has been there for centuries, asking its silent question and offering its ambiguous gift. But for now, let the images fade. Let the faces dissolve back into the darkness from which they came. Let the long history of reflection settle into rest, as the craftsmen of Murano once rested after their long days at the furnace, as the workers of Paris once rested despite the mercury in their lungs, as all the countless people who have ever looked into a mirror and wondered what they saw have eventually rested, laying down the burden of self-awareness for the brief mercy of sleep. The river still flows, the glass still gleams, and somewhere in the darkness the face in the water waits patiently for morning, ready to show you yourself once more. Sleep well, and let the gentle current of the past carry you into peaceful dreams.